Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Lunora, where history is told in whispers as soft as the night breeze. I wish you a warm and peaceful evening, and if you're winding down after a long day, let Lunora take you on a special journey. A journey back through time to listen to the story of the United States of America, the land we call home today. If we go far enough back, long before flags, constitutions, or cities glowing with electric light, this place was simply part of the vast North American continent, a land stretching from the sweeping prairies of the Midwest to the icy mountains of Alaska. There were no borders, no states, no skyscrapers, only the ancient paths of indigenous peoples, rivers that had flowed quietly for thousands of years, and a night sky blanketed with stars, still and vast, like an old map etched by time itself. Thousands of years before European ships appeared, brilliant cultures thrived here. In the heartland, Cahokia Mounds State Historic Site flourished between 1050 and 1350, a carefully planned city with a central plaza, temples, and ceremonial mounds rising from the earth. Around the year 1100, Cahokia's population was even larger than London's at the same time, a remarkable fact that modern history rarely mentions. In the southwest, Mesa Verde National Park preserves the legacy of communities who built intricate stone dwellings into the cliffs, resilient and enduring through the ages. In the northeast, the Iroquois Confederacy created a structured political system with complex councils, a form of governance that resembled an early constitution. Trade networks once stretched from the Great Lakes all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Shells, flint, turquoise, copper, food, and ceremonial gifts moved across thousands of miles. All of this shows that long before the name America was ever written down, this land had a long, intricate, and well-organized past. Then came a day in 1492. From across the Atlantic, a white sail appeared. The voyage of Christopher Columbus, backed by the Kingdom of Spain, set in motion one of the great turning points in world history, the great encounter between two continents that had been separated for tens of thousands of years. 1492 was no random year. Just 45 years earlier, the fall of Constantinople in 1453 had shifted the entire east-west trade route, pushing European empires into a new age of exploration. That same year, Spain completed the Reconquista, unifying the nation after centuries of religious conflict. When Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, he wasn't just seeking a new world. He pulled Europe, Africa, and the Americas into a sweeping era of transformation, an age history remembers as the Great Change. From that moment, the story of North America was no longer only the story of its indigenous peoples. It became part of the greater flow of global history, shaped by trade, religion, empires, disease, and wars that would define the centuries to come. From a land without a nation, the United States would transform over the course of more than 500 years into a global superpower. And that transformation is not just its story alone, it's tied to humanity's greatest milestones: the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, 2 world wars of the 20th, and the technological and artificial intelligence revolutions of the 21st. And tonight, I will tell you that story. From the dawn of a continent to the age of a superpower, like a gentle, slow-flowing memory, so you can listen, relax, and let yourself drift into the quiet of the night. Before European ships cut across the ocean in 1492, the land that would one day be called the United States of America was not an empty space in history. It was a living tapestry, a long, flowing symphony written through the footsteps of indigenous communities, through the smoke rising from village hearths, through songs carried by sun festivals, and along winding trails connecting deep forests to golden fields of corn. Around 12,000 years before the Common Era, after the last ice age came to an end, groups of people crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Asia and gradually spread south across North America. Over the course of thousands of years, they didn't just survive, they built vibrant, complex social networks reflecting a remarkable ability to adapt to the land around them. By around the year 500 of the Common Era, many indigenous cultures were thriving, with clearly layered social structures, religious ceremonies, artistic traditions, agriculture, and far-reaching trade. One of the most remarkable centers of this pre-Columbian world rose in what is now the state of Illinois. Cahokia, Mounds State Historic Site. By around the year 1050, Cahokia reached its golden age. It became the largest urban center in North America before Columbus, with a population estimated at 20,000, more than London at the same time, which had about 15,000 people. The city featured a vast central plaza, an enormous earthen pyramid known as Monk's Mound, standing 30 meters tall, levees, storehouses, and neighborhoods laid out in alignment with the rising and setting of the sun. Cahokia was not alone. In the arid southwest, the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde National Park emerged, built by the ancestral Puebloans in the 12th century. Their stone stairways, circular kiva meeting rooms, and astronomical carvings reveal a sophisticated understanding of the cosmos and the rhythm of time. These communities were not isolated. Trade routes stretched from the Four Corners region down to the Gulf of Mexico, carrying turquoise, shells, corn, herbs, pottery, and stories. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the Mississippian trade network reached its peak, spanning nearly half the continent. The great rivers, the Mississippi, Missouri, and Ohio, were the highways of the ancient world, where wooden canoes carried goods and cultural memory. Tribal alliances like the Iroquois Confederacy in the Northeast formed not just to defend territory, but to maintain harmony between humans and nature. They built councils, held assemblies, and even elected leaders, social structures that would later inspire some of the founding fathers of the United States. Beyond these shores, the world was moving too. When Cahokia was flourishing, Baghdad stood at the heart of the Islamic Golden Age. Paris and London were rising alongside medieval cathedrals, and the Mongol Empire, beginning around 1206, was expanding across vast lands from Eastern Europe to Asia. As old empires extended their reach, North America remained a land of freedom, where society followed the cycles of the seasons, the worship of the sun, and a deep symbiosis with the earth. Between 1300 and 1350, Cahokia began to decline under the weight of climate change, flooding, and population pressure. At nearly the same time, Europe was thrown into chaos by the Black Death between 1347 and 1351, claiming tens of millions of lives. Though the two sides of the ocean seemed disconnected, global shifts in climate and disease were already reshaping history. As the Mississippi Valley grew quiet across the ocean, an age of exploration was slowly awakening. In the silence of North America's valleys and ancient forests, hundreds of indigenous communities lived, farmed, and traded with one another. They passed down their memory through generations, guided by the stars, the rivers, and the land to measure time and space. They did not yet know that only a few decades later, ships from the west would appear, carrying a wave of change powerful enough to shatter the order they had built over thousands of years. While their world remained calm, another world had already begun to move. At the meeting point of these two worlds, between indigenous civilizations and the first footsteps of Europe, the United States began its most profound transformation in history. If you listen closely to the forests of the East, the plains of the Midwest, or the mountains of the Southwest, you can hear it. History did not begin in 1492. It began long before, when the sky was the calendar, The rivers were the map, and the land was the memory. From that foundation, the civilizations of the Americas grew strong and enduring over millennia, leaving their mark in every layer of earth, in every ancient site, and in the memory of the land that would one day be called the United States of America. Between the 5th and 15th centuries, while Europe was quietly shifting from the medieval era toward the age of exploration, the North American continent witnessed the flourishing of many indigenous cultures. These were not simply nomadic tribes as often depicted in modern textbooks. They were organized societies with belief systems, legal structures, sustainable agriculture, and advanced astronomical knowledge. In the heart of the Mississippi River Valley, Cahokia Mound's State Historic Site once stood as a shining city. By around the year 1150, Cahokia had become the largest religious, commercial, and political center north of Mexico. From the top of Monk's Mound, a leader could look out across a settlement that stretched for hundreds of hectares. Archaeologists have found traces of massive wooden palisade walls surrounding the central district, with distinct zones for residential living, ceremonial gatherings, and production. Indigenous astronomers erected giant timber circles, Woodhenge, to observe the movement of the sun, track solstices, and regulate the planting seasons. It was not chance, it was accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. Farther to the southwest, in the dry lands of what is now Mesa Verde National Park, the ancestral Puebloans learned to turn stone and sand into shelter. Beginning in the 12th century, they built entire cliff villages, sturdy architectural complexes tucked deep into the rock walls, protecting their communities from storms and invasion. Tiered homes were connected by wooden ladders, and the circular kiva rooms became cultural and spiritual gathering spaces. The spirals, suns, and geometric lines carved into the stone were not mere decoration. They were a language to record the cycles of time. These cultures did not exist in isolation. From about the year 900 to 1300, a vibrant trade network stretched from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf of Mexico. Dugout canoes glided along the Ohio, Mississippi, and Missouri rivers, carrying corn, turquoise, shells, dyes, and sacred symbols. Every object told a story passed from generation to generation, proof that this was not a wild or empty land, but a complex world of movement, exchange, and meaning. In the northeast, the Iroquois Confederacy, formed between the 12th and 15th centuries, stood as a remarkably advanced political structure. Tribes such as the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca united under an intertribal council system. Instead of a single monarch, they governed through consensus, a model that would later inspire some of the founding fathers of the United States in the 18th century as they drafted the first Constitution. Long before Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, indigenous councils already debated, negotiated, and reached decisions according to principles Europeans would later call primitive democracy. Meanwhile, the outside world was also changing. In Asia, the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan rose in 1206, creating the largest overland trade network of the medieval era, an expanded Silk Road. In Europe, around 1215, the Magna Carta was signed, laying the groundwork for political liberties to come. These events may have seemed distant from the Americas, but they were early links in a chain of global shifts that would eventually send European ships across the ocean at the end of the 15th century. By around 1350, Cahokia began to decline. The climate shifted. A cooling period known as the Little Ice Age began to creep in. Flooding, crop failures, and internal conflicts slowly silenced what had once been a great city. At the same time, across the Atlantic, the Black Death swept through Europe, killing nearly a third of its population and shaking the foundations of medieval empires. Out of that chaos, European nations began seeking new routes. setting the stage for an age of exploration that just 1.5 centuries later would carry their sails across the ocean. Indigenous spirituality in North America did not revolve around a single god, nor was it a rigid system of dogma. Instead, it was a living network, a worldview in which every mountain, every river, and every creature carried its own spirit, each one a part of a greater whole of which humans were only a single link. From the 10th to the 15th century, while the Mongol Empire expanded across Eurasia and Paris began raising its great Gothic cathedrals, indigenous communities in North America were looking to the sky to guide their future. On the summer solstice, the people of Cahokia Mounds State Historic Site gathered around the wooden circle known as Woodhenge to watch the sun rise at the exact marked point on the horizon. This wasn't just a closed religious ritual, it was a part of the cycle of survival. When the sun rose, it signaled the time to plant. When it set toward the southwest, they knew the harvest season was near. These ceremonies repeated for generations, becoming the natural clock of their entire society. In the arid southwest, the ancestral Puebloans of Mesa Verde National Park and Chaco Culture National Historical Park built their structures precisely aligned with the paths of the sun and moon. They observed how shadows shifted across the rock walls to mark agricultural cycles, festivals, and communal gatherings. Many of the spiral carvings on stone were not mere decoration. They were star maps, solar-lunar calendars, ways to remember and measure time before the existence of written language in the Western sense. To them, the sky was not something above. It was part of life itself. The constellations were collective memory. Each community had its own stories to explain the world, not through formulas or equations, but through myth and ritual. The red fox, the eagle, the guardian of the sun. These figures were not random. They were the way indigenous peoples connected the movement of the cosmos with the human journey. Between the 11th and 14th centuries, vast trade networks flourished across the continent. Turquoise from the southwest traveled north, shells from the Gulf of Mexico floated up the great rivers to the Midwest. Early harvest corn from Ohio was exchanged for flint from the Lake Superior region. There were no national borders, but there were well-established trade routes, passed down from one generation to the next, the economic backbone of pre-Columbian North America. And indigenous spirituality was never separate from this flow. Every trader, every traveler carried cultural symbols with them: turquoise rings, ceremonial masks, hide drums, carved spirit stones. These objects carried stories, beliefs, and worldviews. That is why the same symbols often appear across distant regions, not as copies, but as shared cultural currents with unique local meanings. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, empires were rising. In 1453, the fall of Constantinople brought the Byzantine Empire to an end and pushed European powers into a race for new trade routes. In 1487, Bartolomeu Dias of Portugal rounded the Cape of Good Hope. In 1492, Christopher Columbus set sail from Palos de la Frontera. As these explorers searched for a passage to Asia, they had no idea that across the ocean, thriving networks of trade and belief had already existed for centuries, without European maps or iron compasses. Religion in Europe at that time was bound by a single Christian orthodoxy, but among the indigenous peoples of the Americas, each community was its own small universe, guided by a belief that life was a circle. Everything eventually returns to where it began. There was no absolute ruler in their spiritual world, but a relationship of reciprocity. Humans had to live in harmony with the land or the crops would wither. Rivers had to be respected or the fish would not return in spawning season. The sky had to be listened to or one would lose the way. As the 15th century drew to a close, Europe prepared to cross the sea to discover new worlds. But the truth is, They did not discover an empty land. They stepped onto a continent with its own spirit, its own memory, and its own order. And that collision, more than a single event, in 1492, became a turning point in global history. On August 3rd, 1492, at the port of Palos de la Frontera in the Kingdom of Spain, 3 small ships, the Santa Maria, the Niña, and the Pinta, set sail. Leading the expedition was Christopher Columbus, a navigator from Genoa who believed that by sailing west he could find a shorter route to Asia, the land of silk, spices, and gold that Europe so desperately craved. Behind those sails was the pressure of a restless continent, hungry to break out into the world. Just a few decades earlier, in 1453, the fall of Constantinople had cut off Europe's traditional trade routes through the Middle East, forcing European powers to seek new paths. Spain, having just completed the Reconquista, in January 1492, with the fall of Granada, emerged for the first time as a strong, unified Christian kingdom ready to sail across oceans. That same year, the Spanish crown also issued the Edict of Expulsion against Jewish communities, a sign of a Europe stepping into an era of empire building and religious zeal. On October 12, 1492, after more than 2 months at sea, Columbus spotted a light on Guanahani, present-day Bahamas. At that moment, he believed he had reached the outskirts of East Asia. He had no idea he was standing on a continent unknown to Europeans. This marked the beginning of what historians would later call the Age of Discovery, a turning point that would reshape the world forever. On that land Columbus stepped onto, indigenous peoples had lived for thousands of years. They did not need compasses. They read direction from the wind, the stars, and the scent of the seasons. They had no maps, but the continent was woven together by invisible trade networks carried in ancestral memory. When Columbus landed, 2 worlds, separated since the end of the last ice age more than 15,000 years earlier, finally met. It was a collision on a geological scale, a global turning point. The 15th century was a time of explosive change in Europe. In 1450, Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press, spreading knowledge faster than ever before. Ancient Greek and Arabic geographic texts, nautical maps and charts were copied and passed between sailors and scholars. Technologies like the magnetic compass from China, stern-post rudders, and the agile Portuguese caravel made the seas more navigable than ever. Royal courts, especially in the Kingdom of Portugal and Spain, saw the ocean as a promise of gold, spices, and power. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, indigenous communities had no idea history was about to open a new chapter. They still lit fires along the Mississippi River, observed the moon from the cliffs of Mesa Verde National Park, and watched the sun rise through the wooden circle of Woodhenge, trusting the seasons to return. But the moment Columbus's ships landed, their world would no longer move at the rhythm of nature alone. It would be swept into a global current. In the years that followed, voyages multiplied. In 1493, Columbus returned to the Caribbean with 17 ships. In 1497, John Cabot, sailing under the English flag, began exploring North America's eastern coast. In 1500, Pedro Álvares Cabral of Portugal reached Brazil, and in 1519, Hernán Cortés landed on the mainland of Mexico. In less than 30 years, the map of the world expanded more than at any other point in history up to that time. Historians call this transformative moment the Atlantic encounter. When Christopher Columbus set foot on the island of Guanahani in 1492, he could not have known that from that moment on, an entire continent would become a grand chessboard for the empires rising across the Atlantic. In the early years of the 16th century, sails were no longer just symbols of exploration. They became banners of power. Every ship carried not only sailors, but also laws, faith, ambition, and invisible diseases, In 1494, the Kingdom of Spain and the Kingdom of Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, an agreement that divided the non-European world into two spheres of influence. A line on a map, invisible to the people who actually lived on the land, determined the fate of hundreds of millions. Everything to the west of the line belonged to Spain, everything to the east belonged to Portugal. Neither empire asked anyone who lived there for permission. To them, the world was a blank sheet of paper, ready to be redrawn. Throughout the 16th century, Spain became the first European power to build a vast colonial empire in the Americas. After Hernán Cortés conquered the Aztec Empire in 1521 and Francisco Pizarro overthrew the Inca Empire in 1533, treasure from the New World, gold, silver, rare feathers, cacao, poured into Europe. The port of Seville became the first true global trade hub, where galleons from Potosi in present-day Bolivia arrived heavy with silver. But these ships carried more than treasure. They set in motion the first wave of global integration. In 1522, Ferdinand Magellan's circumnavigation of the globe was completed. By 1545, the Trans-Pacific Silver Route between Mexico and Manila was established. This was the first age of globalization, and the Americas were at its center. In the north of the continent, expeditions came more slowly, but they were no less intense. By the early 17th century, other European powers, England, France, and the Netherlands, joined the race. In 1607, Jamestown was founded in Virginia, becoming England's first permanent colony in North America. A year later, in 1608, Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec City for the Kingdom of France. In 1624, the Dutch seized Manhattan Island, later to become New York City, and named it New Amsterdam. For indigenous peoples, what followed was an unfamiliar and overwhelming tide. In less than a generation, the ships that once arrived as strangers now came as lawgivers. Europeans brought with them alcohol, iron, muskets, horses, and diseases unknown on the continent: smallpox, measles, influenza. In the 16th century alone, waves of epidemics devastated indigenous populations. In some regions, between 70 and 90% of the population died within a few decades, a biological catastrophe without precedent in human history. Meanwhile, Europe itself was changing. In 1517, Martin Luther ignited the Protestant Reformation, shaking the once unified Christian order. Religion became a new driving force behind migration. English Puritans, facing pressure from the state church, would eventually carry their faith across the Atlantic in the 17th century. At the same time, the rise of mercantilism turned colonies into engines of wealth for their mother countries. By then, the Atlantic Ocean had become a shared highway. From 1500 to 1700, thousands of ships carried goods, people, and less tangible cargo, laws, languages, and belief systems. But not all who crossed the ocean did so willingly. In 1619, the first ship carrying enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia, marking the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. Over the next 2 centuries, millions of Africans were captured, sold, and transported in chains to the Americas, forming the forced labor backbone of tobacco, sugar, and cotton plantations. On the surface, ports bustled and colonial towns grew. Beneath, a cultural and social earthquake was underway. The map of power was redrawn. New languages, religions, and laws were imposed on lands that had once been free. Indigenous worlds did not disappear overnight, but they began to be eroded layer by layer from the coasts inward. In Europe in 1588, the defeat of the Spanish Armada by England marked a turning point, shifting naval dominance from Spain to Britain. And in North America, the first fragile seeds of English colonies had taken root. Small as they were, those seeds would grow into a new world power in less than 2 centuries. By the late 17th century, the small colonial ports along the Atlantic coast were no longer just distant points of light on a map. The European empires had begun to see North America not as a faraway land, but as a strategic chessboard. Abundant natural resources, favorable shipping routes, and critical geopolitical positioning all fused into a prize no major power was willing to ignore. And as history has shown time and again, where ambitions overlap, war is never far behind. Spain had arrived in the New World first, but its power began to wane by the mid-17th century. After the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, naval dominance shifted to the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Meanwhile, the Kingdom of France quietly built a colonial network in the north, relying on fur trade and strategic alliances with indigenous nations. The great rivers, the St. Lawrence River and the Mississippi River, became vital arteries that France used to project its power deep into the continent. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec City. Within a few decades, the French established an extensive trade route stretching from Canada to Louisiana. Unlike the English, the French didn't send large waves of settlers. Instead, they built a flexible web of traders, missionaries, and military outposts, thin threads that wove their influence across the interior. This adaptability allowed them to form powerful alliances with indigenous nations such as the Huron, Algonquin, and Illiniwek. The English, on the other hand, concentrated their efforts on the eastern seaboard. Colonies like Jamestown, 1607, Plymouth Colony, 1620, and Massachusetts Bay Colony, 1630, grew rapidly through waves of migration. Unlike the French, the English came to stay. They built villages, opened schools, established local governments, and expanded agriculture. Their presence took root like deep tree roots, slowly pushing westward. For indigenous nations, this was a time of immense upheaval. They faced not only European settlers, but also the wars between competing empires. Tribal nations were forced to make difficult choices, ally with one power against another, or try to remain neutral in a game where true neutrality did not exist. The Beaver Wars, 1640 to 1701, are a stark example. Over 60 years, the Iroquois Confederacy, supported by the English, expanded its control over the fur trade, clashing with tribes allied with the French. The conflict was not just about resources, it was a struggle to determine who would dominate the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence region. Beyond the Americas, the world was shifting dramatically. In 1648, the Peace of Westphalia ended the 30 Years' War in Europe, laying the foundations for the modern nation-state system. In the aftermath, empires sought overseas expansion to recover and grow. North America became the ideal proving ground. In the second half of the 17th century, conflict between England and the Netherlands erupted into the Anglo-Dutch Wars. In 1664, England captured New Amsterdam from the Dutch and renamed it New York City. This was a turning point. Control of the northeastern coast shifted decisively to England. The Dutch retreated from the North American colonial race, leaving two dominant rivals, England and France. The 18th century opened to the smell of gunpowder. Queen Anne's War, 1702 to 1713, King George's War, 1744 to 1748, and ultimately the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, turned North America into an extended battlefield for Europe's imperial struggles. The final war was not only a clash between two empires, but also a matter of survival for many indigenous nations. Some sided with the French, others with the English, but most paid a devastating price when the smoke cleared. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris marked the end of the war. France lost nearly all its North American colonies. England emerged as the dominant power over almost the entire eastern half of the continent, from Canada to Florida. The balance of power had shifted entirely. But that very victory planted the seeds of future conflict. As the English colonies grew in size, wealth, and self-awareness, the distance between mother country and colony widened. At the same time, the world was entering an age of explosive new ideas. Between 1740 and 1770, the Age of Enlightenment spread across Europe. The concepts of liberty, natural rights, and popular sovereignty, championed by thinkers like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Voltaire, crossed the Atlantic, taking root in the minds of colonists. They no longer saw themselves as mere pioneers serving a distant king. They began to ask a different question, one that would soon change history. Who are we and what might we become? After 1763, when the Kingdom of Great Britain emerged victorious in the French and Indian War and gained control over nearly all of eastern North America, it seemed as if a new, golden era was about to begin. But history rarely moves in straight lines. The moment an empire reaches its peak is often the moment when the first cracks begin to form. In the American colonies, something was stirring, not in the halls of Parliament, but in taverns, print shops, local assemblies, and in the fields where ordinary people began to question their place in a larger world. Britain had spent enormous sums of money on the war. To cover its massive debt, the Parliament of the United Kingdom decided to increase taxes on the American colonies. In 1764, the Sugar Act imposed duties on imported sugar and rum. 1 year later, the Stamp Act of 1765 required that every legal document, newspaper, pamphlet, and contract carry a royal tax stamp. To colonists, this wasn't just about money, it was a reminder that they were still subjects, with no real voice in the decisions that affected their lives. Out of this moment came a rallying cry: no taxation without representation. Colonists began asking, why should they pay taxes to a parliament in London when no one represented them? Why should people living across an ocean have the right to decide their fate? These questions started as scattered whispers, but soon echoed from Boston to Philadelphia, from New York to Charleston. As tax laws stacked one upon another, Enlightenment ideas from Europe crossed the Atlantic. Translations of John Locke's writings on natural rights, Montesquieu's theories of separation of powers, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau's concept of the social contract were printed, copied, and passed hand to hand in colonial coffeehouses and print shops. To colonists, these were no longer abstract philosophy. They were answers to the frustrations building in everyday life. If all men are born with natural rights to liberty and property, then why should they bow to laws imposed by a distant power? By 1765, resistance groups began to form. The Sons of Liberty emerged first in Boston, bringing together merchants, craftsmen, intellectuals, and farmers who opposed royal policies. They had no formal army, no grand weapons, but they had unity and the power to ignite public outrage. Rallies, pamphlets, and symbolic acts began to spread, from burning effigies of British officials to organizing boycotts of imported goods. In 1770, a seemingly small incident sparked a larger movement, the Boston Massacre. When British soldiers opened fire on a protesting crowd, killing 5 people, tensions erupted. The colonial press, increasingly influential, transformed the event into a powerful symbol of imperial oppression. 3 years later, in 1773, the Boston Tea Party shook the relationship across the Atlantic even further. When colonists disguised as Mohawk men boarded ships and dumped hundreds of chests of tea belonging to the British East India Company into Boston Harbor, they weren't just protesting a tea tax. They were sending a message: we will no longer be treated as second-class subjects. The British response was harsh. In 1774, Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts, closing Boston Harbor, stripping Massachusetts of its self-government, and increasing the military presence. But instead of breaking the colonies, these actions united them. For the first time, the colonies began to feel that they shared a common fate. Intercolonial meetings were held, and in September 1774, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, a decisive turning point. Representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered to defend their collective rights. Meanwhile, the language of liberty continued to spread. The writings of Thomas Paine, especially his pamphlet Common Sense, 1776, set fire to already dry tinder. "Nothing is more natural than independence," he wrote. Tens of thousands of copies were circulated, transforming independence from a vague dream into a tangible goal. While colonists' political consciousness evolved, a larger intellectual storm was sweeping Europe. The age of enlightenment was undermining old power structures. The revolutions yet to come, from France in 1789 to independence movements across Latin America, would all be influenced by the ideas taking root in the American colonies during this period. In early 1775, no one could say for certain that a new nation would soon emerge. But one thing was undeniable: the colonists no longer saw themselves as British subjects in the New World. In their minds, a new identity was forming, a community with the right to decide its own destiny, and that seed, just a year later, would ignite into the flames of revolution. In the summer of 1776, the cobblestone streets of Philadelphia radiated with the same sweltering heat they always did this time of year. But inside the dimly lit rooms of the Pennsylvania State House, today known as Independence Hall, a quiet but fierce debate was unfolding. On dark wooden tables, quill pens were not just drafting a political statement. They were writing a new chapter in the history of the world. After more than a decade of rising tensions with the Kingdom of Great Britain, after events like the Boston Massacre in 1770 and the Boston Tea Party in 1773, the colonies no longer saw the mother country as a homeland to return to. They saw it as a set of chains that had grown too tight. When the intolerable acts were passed and British soldiers were quartered in colonial towns, the idea of independence ceased to be a fringe notion. It became a wave sweeping across all 13 colonies. On April 19, 1775, the first shots rang out at Lexington and Concord. The battles of Lexington and Concord marked the beginning of the War for Independence. Farmers, craftsmen, scholars, ordinary people took up arms against one of the most powerful empires on earth. As the smoke of those first shots lingered, a larger question emerged. This was no longer about isolated protests. This was a struggle to decide the fate of a people taking shape. On May 10, 1775, the Second Continental Congress convened. George Washington was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. But war was only the surface. The root lay in an idea: how to transform a collection of colonies into a legitimate, independent nation. In June 1776, a committee of 5 was appointed to draft an official declaration. The youngest among them, only 33 years old, was Thomas Jefferson, a lawyer, philosopher, and gifted writer. For nights on end, he worked in silence, drawing inspiration from the Enlightenment, from John Locke's Natural Rights, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Social Contract, and the colonists' own anger at oppression. On July 4, 1776, after days of debate and revision, the Declaration of Independence was adopted. It began with words that would echo across centuries. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." This was more than a political document. It was a declaration to the entire world that a new people demanded the right to exist. When the bell rang out from the State House tower, it did not just mark a moment in Philadelphia, it reverberated across all 13 colonies. from cold Boston to humid Charleston, as a rallying cry. And the world was listening. At that time, the global order was still dominated by European empires. A group of colonies declaring independence from Britain seemed almost unthinkable. But the Kingdom of France, long a rival of Britain, saw an opportunity. The American Revolution was no longer a domestic affair. It became a lever in a global geopolitical contest. In 1777 to 1778, after the crucial American victory at the Battle of Saratoga, France formally recognized and allied with the young United States. This was a decisive turning point. What had begun as an isolated rebellion now became part of a worldwide conflict among empires. The war was far from easy. The Americans lacked weapons, funding, and experience. But they possessed something few empires did, a shared belief that they were fighting not for a throne, but for the right of a people to exist. At Valley Forge in the winter of 1777 to 1778, thousands of soldiers suffered from hunger, cold, and disease. Yet in that hardship the Continental Army grew more unified than ever. While musket smoke hung over the Americas, the American Revolutionary War expanded into a global conflict. In 1779, the Kingdom of Spain declared war on Britain. In 1780, the Dutch Republic was pulled into the struggle as well. A colonial uprising had become an international war, but the true essence of 1776 did not lie in the muskets or the battles. It lay in a piece of writing. Never before in the modern era had a group of colonies dared to declare that power did not flow from kings, but from the people themselves. That idea would not only shape the United States, it would ignite revolutions around the world. The words written on the Declaration of Independence echoed through the 13 colonies like an unbreakable oath. Once they had declared separation from the Kingdom of Great Britain, there was no turning back. What had once been acts of protest and political debate now became a full-scale war. On one side stood the most powerful naval empire in the world. On the other, a young alliance with little money, few weapons, limited experience, but an unshakable will. The war had already begun before the declaration was signed. On April 19, 1775, at Lexington and Concord, the first shots were fired, launching the American Revolutionary War. The British believed that a ragtag group of farmers and merchants could never stand against a professional army. But those first gunshots sparked a wildfire of resistance. Within months, colonial militias had joined together to form the Continental Army under the leadership of George Washington. The early years of the war, 1775 to 1777, were a trial by fire. The Continental Army lacked weapons, supplies, and even shoes for winter marches. The Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775 revealed the fierce determination of the Americans, even as they were forced to retreat under superior British firepower. In 1776, the British captured New York City, turning it into their main military headquarters for the rest of the war. Facing overwhelming odds, Washington adopted a strategy of guerrilla warfare, avoiding large-scale battles, stretching the conflict, and exhausting British resolve. But the war was never fought in isolation. The world was watching. After the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga in October 1777, international confidence in the revolution soared. This was a turning point. France, Britain's old rival, decided to openly support the American cause. In February 1778, the alliance treaty was signed. France sent weapons, funds, and most importantly, its navy and troops. By 1779, the Kingdom of Spain joined the war, and in 1780, the Dutch Republic was drawn in as well. What began as a colonial rebellion had become a global conflict. The winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge was one of the darkest moments of the war. More than 2,000 American soldiers died of cold, hunger, and disease. But it was also at Valley Forge that the army was reborn. With the help of Prussian officer Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, the troops were drilled in European military tactics, gaining discipline and strength. The Continental Army was no longer just a collection of local militias. It was now a fighting force. Meanwhile, the British, despite their superior power, faced a war fought thousands of miles from home. The longer it dragged on, the more expensive it became. From 1778 onward, with France entering the war, Britain was forced to split its naval forces to defend its colonies in the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean. Its strategic advantage began to unravel. The final phase of the war, 1778 to 1783, saw the Americans take the initiative. Washington and generals like Nathanael Greene launched campaigns in the South, while the French Navy secured key waters. In October 1781, the siege of Yorktown became the decisive turning point. British forces under Charles Cornwallis were trapped by the combined American and French armies and forced to surrender. When the drums of surrender echoed, the empire that once ruled the seas bowed to a nation less than a decade old. The news of Yorktown hit London like a thunderclap. After years of costly war, Britain realized a total victory was impossible. Peace talks began. On September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, officially recognizing the United States as an independent nation. A new chapter of world history had begun. The American victory was not won by battles alone. It was the result of international alliances, revolutionary political ideas, and an unwavering commitment to self-determination. From the farmers at Lexington to the freezing soldiers at Valley Forge, a nation had been forged in fire. The impact of the American Revolution reached far beyond its borders. In Paris, French intellectuals saw a small nation overthrow a great empire, planting the seeds of the French Revolution. Across Latin America, freedom movements looked north for inspiration. In less than a decade, the world map now included a new nation, not granted by kings, but claimed by the people themselves. The war ended in the autumn of 1783. The gunpowder smoke had cleared, and the white flags no longer fluttered before the camps of the Kingdom of Great Britain. But victory was only the beginning. A young nation had been born, without a king, without nobility, without a royal court, and most importantly, without a unified political system. After 8 years of war, the Americans had proven they could defeat an empire. The question now was, could they govern themselves? As early as 1777, in the middle of the war, the Articles of Confederation had been adopted as a temporary constitution. It created a loose confederation of 13 states. Each state retained its sovereignty, and the central government had almost no real power. The Continental Congress could not levy taxes, had no standing army, and could not regulate trade between states. These weaknesses were less visible during wartime, when unity was forged by necessity. But when peace returned, the cracks began to show. Between 1783 and 1786, the United States entered what many historians call the fragile period. States acted like independent countries, imposing their own taxes, taxing one another's trade, and printing their own currencies, which led to economic chaos. Farmers in Massachusetts, crushed by debt and taxation, rose up in Shays' Rebellion, 1786 to 1787. That uprising made clear to many leaders that the new nation could collapse from within if a stronger legal framework was not established. Beyond its borders, the world was still shifting rapidly. Although Great Britain had recognized American independence, it maintained troops in the Northwest Territory. The Kingdom of Spain controlled the Mississippi River, threatening vital western trade routes. Indigenous nations, particularly in the Ohio region, continued to resist expansion. This young nation, with no federal army and weak finances, faced enormous challenges. In this climate, the country's leading figures realized they could not let the new republic drift into chaos. In 1787, the Constitutional Convention was convened in Philadelphia. 55 delegates from 12 states, all but Rhode Island, gathered in the same room where the Declaration of Independence had been signed. Presiding over the convention was George Washington, retired from the army but still a symbol of national unity. The debates were intense. How could power be balanced between the federal government and the states? How could they avoid the tyranny they had just overthrown while still building a government strong enough to endure? James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Benjamin Franklin were among the key figures in these discussions. They debated not only with political theory, but also with the memory of war, a memory of what might be lost if the nation fractured. The result was the United States Constitution, drafted over 4 months between May and September 1787. It created a stronger federal government with 3 distinct branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. Congress gained the power to tax, regulate commerce, and command a federal military. A president would be elected to execute the laws, and a Supreme Court would safeguard the Constitution. The aim was clear: prevent the return of chaos while avoiding the authoritarian models of Europe. In September 1787, the Constitution was signed, but it needed ratification by at least 9 of the 13 states to take effect. That was no easy task. Many feared a strong central government would trample states' rights, just as the British Crown had. A heated debate broke out between the Federalists, who supported the Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists, who opposed it. To win public support, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay wrote the Federalist Papers, a series of 85 essays explaining why the Constitution was necessary to protect liberty, not destroy it. The debate lasted nearly 2 years. In June 1788, New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify, and the Constitution officially took effect. To reassure those worried about individual rights, in 1791, the United States Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, was added, protecting freedoms such as speech, religion, the right to bear arms, and the right to a fair trial. With this, the young nation finally had a solid legal foundation for its republic. In April 1789, George Washington was inaugurated as the first President of the United States. His ceremony at Federal Hall in New York was modest: no throne, no crown, no royal pageantry. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to uphold the Constitution, the document he had helped bring into being. The world had never witnessed a transfer of power quite like it, from armed revolution to a constitutional government, without civil war or military dictatorship. The Constitution of 1787 became more than just a framework for the United States. It became a model for nations around the world, inspiring movements from the French Revolution of 1789 to independence struggles across Latin America. It marked a turning point in human history, a shift from rule by kings to rule by the people. When George Washington stepped out onto the balcony of Federal Hall in April 1789 to take the oath of office as the first President of the United States, he stood before a young and fragile nation. Behind him lay a hard-won independence. Ahead of him, to the west, stretched an immense, undefined expanse. It was a land of rolling plains, rugged mountains, deep rivers, and countless indigenous communities that had lived there for thousands of years. In the stillness of that western frontier, a new chapter of American history was about to begin. In the early years of the Republic, the government's priority was to stabilize the nation politically and economically. But alongside that was a much larger vision: westward expansion. This wasn't just a geographic ambition, it was a belief that the young republic had a mission to spread freedom and development. Later, this idea would take on a symbolic name, manifest destiny. The first steps were deliberate. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 established a legal framework for organizing and expanding lands west of the Ohio River, setting a precedent for how future states would be formed. Unlike previous empires that treated territory as mere colonial possessions, the United States created a system through which new territories could become equal states, a key element of its national development. But expansion was never just a matter of drawing lines on a map. It meant conflict. Indigenous nation, but including the Shawnee, Miami Tribe of Oklahoma, Delaware Tribe of Indians, and Wyandot Nation of Kansas, resisted the growing tide of settlement. Between 1785 and 1795, a series of violent clashes erupted, culminating in the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. American forces under Anthony Wayne defeated the Tribal Confederation, forcing the signing of the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, which ceded most of Ohio to the United States. This marked one of the first major steps in America's westward expansion. Meanwhile, the world was undergoing its own upheavals. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted, shaking Europe to its core. Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power, plunging the French First Republic into continent-wide wars. These events opened a historic opportunity for the United States. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson completed what would become one of the greatest territorial deals in American history, the Louisiana Purchase. For about $15 million, the U.S. acquired Louisiana from France, a territory that doubled the nation's size, stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. Overnight, the map of America was transformed. This purchase was more than a land deal. It was an unspoken declaration that the United States would not remain an Atlantic coastal nation. Jefferson believed the strength of the country lay in vast space or in fertile land, in the power to expand, in shaping its destiny free from European empires. To explore this new frontier, he sent an expedition led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. The Lewis and Clark expedition, 1804 to 1806, traversed the Missouri River, crossed the Rocky Mountains, and reached the Pacific Ocean. Their journey was more than a geographic survey. It was a confirmation that America could push its boundaries farther west than anyone had imagined. But every step westward came with growing tensions. Expansion meant displacement. Communities that had lived on these lands for centuries were forced to retreat further inland. Treaties were signed, or often under military pressure, paving the way for waves of white settlement. These conflicts would not end in the 19th century. They would become a deep historical wound stretching over generations. Meanwhile, European empires were far from idle. The Kingdom of Spain still controlled Florida and much of the Southwest. The United Kingdom maintained its presence in Canada. Expansion was not only about settling new land, it was also a quiet but fierce geopolitical competition with old powers. America's strength was still limited, but its belief in the future was immense. From 1800 to 1820, the U.S. population grew from roughly 5 million to more than 9 million. Small towns appeared along rivers. Corn, cotton, and wheat fields spread. St. Louis, once a modest frontier outpost, became a gateway to the West. To settlers, the West symbolized promise, land opportunity, a new beginning. But to many indigenous communities, it was the shadow of loss. This expansion also raised profound political questions. Should new states allow slavery? How would the balance of power between North and South be maintained? Questions barely considered in 1789 became political flashpoints by 1820. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 served as an early warning. Westward expansion was not just about redrawing maps. It was about redefining the very character of the nation. In the early 19th century, the young nation known as the United States of America seemed to be entering an age of prosperity. The population was growing rapidly, the frontier was expanding, and towns and river ports were springing up along the Mississippi River. But beneath this surface of promise, the country was quietly splitting into three very different regions: an industrializing north, an agrarian and slave-dependent south, and a free and untamed west, a space whose borders were still undefined. The north, centered around New England and the mid-Atlantic states, was experiencing the first wave of industrialization. Textile mills, machine shops, and early railroads rose along rivers like the Merrimack River and Hudson River. In 1790, only about 5% of the population lived in cities, but by 1820 that number had doubled. Boston, New York City, and Philadelphia became bustling centers of trade, manufacturing, and commerce. The North was outward-looking, tied to global trade, investment, and an expanding middle class. The South, however, told a different story. It was the world of sprawling plantations where cotton, tobacco, and rice shaped every rhythm of economic life. The fields of Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia were not just symbols of abundance, but also of dependence on slavery. In the late 18th century, the Industrial Revolution in Britain made cotton a strategic global commodity. In response, the American South ramped up cotton production on an unprecedented scale. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans were forced to work the fields, forming the backbone of Southern wealth. In March 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, a simple machine that separated seeds from cotton fiber with remarkable speed. This seemingly small innovation changed everything. Within 2 decades, the South's cotton output soared, and so did the demand for enslaved labor. By 1820, the enslaved population in the United States had exceeded 1.5 million. While the North gradually phased out slavery, the South tied its prosperity ever more tightly to it. Meanwhile, the West, newly opened after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, carried a very different spirit. It was the land of pioneers, farmers, traders, hunters, and risk-takers in search of fortune. Leaving the crowded eastern cities, they crossed the Appalachian Mountains in search of vast farmland and a new life. Laws were loose, the federal government's presence was thin, and the line between opportunity and danger was razor-sharp. The West was no unified entity. It was a contested space between white settlers, indigenous nations, and lingering European powers. These differences were not just cultural, they were structural. The North moved toward a modern commercial and industrial economy. The South clung to an agricultural system built on slavery. The West remained a neutral but uncertain frontier, and the great question loomed: will the new territories become free states or slave states? This was more than a political debate, it was a battle between two economic and social models. If the West became slave territory, the South would strengthen its power in Congress and preserve its social order. If the West became free territory, the balance would tip toward the North. Every cotton bale, every factory wheel, every mile of frontier became part of a larger national chess game. These tensions sharpened through the 1810s. In 1812, another conflict erupted, the War of 1812 between the United States and the Kingdom of Great Britain. Though neither side emerged with a decisive victory, the war strengthened American national confidence. The United States no longer saw itself as a young nation under Europe's shadow. But with victory came new lands and new struggles over control. By 1820, political tensions reached a boiling point with the Missouri Compromise. When Missouri applied for admission as a slave state, the North fiercely objected. Months of debate ended in compromise. Missouri would be admitted as a slave state, Maine as a free state, maintaining the balance in the Senate. A line at 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude was drawn to divide future territories: free states to the north, slave states to the south. But the Missouri Compromise was only a temporary patch. It didn't solve the underlying conflict, and it merely postponed it. In the roar of textile machines in the north, the crack of whips on southern plantations, and the restless footsteps of pioneers moving west, the United States was quietly splitting along three very different paths. A young nation was growing fast, but not all of its parts were moving in the same direction. After the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the United States entered a period of powerful growth, a time many historians call an age of transformation. The young republic had moved beyond its fragile beginnings and was becoming a political, economic, and social force with tremendous internal momentum. No longer a string of former colonies, the U.S. had become a machine fueled by expansion, industrialization, and a deep faith in its future. The North became the heart of this transformation. In the 1820s and 1830s, textile mills, ironworks, and machine factories multiplied at astonishing speed. Lowell, Massachusetts, emerged as the model for America's first industrial cities, where rivers were harnessed to power massive machinery. Alongside industrial growth came infrastructure expansion. A symbol of this era was the Erie Canal, completed in 1825. Stretching over 580 kilometers, the canal connected the Great Lakes with the Atlantic Ocean, making transportation faster and cheaper than ever. This commercial leap turned New York City into the nation's economic capital. Industrialization brought urbanization. Hundreds of thousands of people from the eastern countryside, along with waves of immigrants from Ireland and Germany, poured into cities in search of factory work. Urban populations grew from about 7% in 1820 to nearly 15% by 1840. Soot-covered streets, cramped boarding houses, and crowded working-class neighborhoods became familiar sights. Life was changing rapidly, and not everyone could keep up. Meanwhile, the West was also undergoing a migration boom. After the Louisiana Purchase expanded U.S. territory, wagon trains and steamboats carried settlers through untamed lands to places like Missouri, Illinois, and Arkansas. River systems, especially the Mississippi River and Ohio River, became the backbone of Western transportation. In 1807, Robert Fulton launched the first commercially successful steamboat, the Clermont, opening a new era of river travel. By the 1830s, hundreds of steamboats carried goods and people across the expanding western frontier. This territorial expansion wasn't just about movement, it was an idea. Americans increasingly believed they had a historic mission to spread freedom and civilization westward, a belief strengthened by economic success and rapid development. This idea would later be named Manifest Destiny, but in these years it existed as a quiet conviction, whispered in speeches printed in newspapers, and carried west in covered wagons full of hope. But expansion also brought new conflicts. Indigenous communities on these lands were pushed farther and farther from their homelands. Treaties forced under pressure, violent confrontations, and mass removals became common. One of the defining events of this era was the Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed under Andrew Jackson. Tens of thousands of Native Americans, especially from the Cherokee Nation, were forced to leave their homes and move west of the Mississippi on a deadly journey remembered as the Trail of Tears. Westward expansion was not just a story of pioneers. It was also the tragedy of those pushed to the margins of history. During this time, America's political system was also changing dramatically. After the presidencies of George Washington and John Adams, the party system became more defined. The Democratic-Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson had long opposed the Federalist Party of Alexander Hamilton. After 1820, however, the Federalists collapsed, and a new political era emerged. The rise of Andrew Jackson and the Democratic Party, United States, marked the beginning of modern popular politics. where farmers, laborers, and immigrants began to have a voice in national affairs. Elections were no longer the domain of elites. Voter turnout rose rapidly as many states abolished property requirements for voting. The growth of mass newspapers, public debates, and raucous campaign rallies transformed American democracy into something loud, competitive, and new. Yet alongside this expansion of democracy came growing division. Slavery remained a simmering fault line. Southern states were increasingly tied to slave labor to meet global cotton demand, while the industrializing North increasingly viewed slavery as a moral stain. The West, where the nation's future was being shaped, became the central battleground over what kind of country America would become. By the early 1830s, the U.S. population had reached nearly 13 million, doubling in just 2 decades. Thriving cities, networks of canals and railroads, and soaring industrial and agricultural output were reshaping the nation. In the eyes of the world, the United States was no longer a fledgling country born of a colonial rebellion. It was a young, restless, and ambitious power, full of contradictions, but brimming with potential. By 1840, the United States stood at the height of its expansion and development. Railroads were knitting the regions together. Waves of migrants were moving steadily westward, driven by a belief in manifest destiny, the conviction that America was destined to stretch from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Yet beneath this sweeping vision lay a colossal contradiction. Half of the nation relied on enslaved labor to sustain its prosperity, while the other half saw slavery as a moral crime and a threat to democracy. A question loomed larger with every passing year. Can a nation so divided endure without tearing itself apart? The South, the land of plantations, entered the 1840s wealthier than ever. Rising global cotton prices made states like South Carolina, Mississippi, and Alabama economic powerhouses of the cotton economy. Planter elites controlled not only the fields, but the political order of the South. Slavery was more than the foundation of the economy, it was the structure of power itself. Millions of people were forced to work without rights, without citizenship, without a voice. By 1850, the enslaved population of the United States had surpassed 3 million. The North, meanwhile, followed an entirely different path. Industry was growing at breakneck speed, trade was booming, and cities like New York City, Boston, and Philadelphia had become centers of finance, transportation, and manufacturing. Many northern states had abolished slavery by the end of the 18th century, and a powerful abolitionist movement was rising. Figures like Frederick Douglass, a former slave, and William Lloyd Garrison with his newspaper, The Liberator, became voices of conscience, calling not only for the end of slavery, but also for a moral reckoning within American society. The West, newly opened after the Louisiana Purchase and subsequent expeditions, became the political battleground between free and slave states. Every new territory raised the same question. Will this be a free state or a slave state? The answer would shape not just millions of lives, but also the balance of power in United States Congress. Each state meant another vote in the Senate, and whichever side held the majority would shape the nation's destiny. Global context made these tensions even sharper. The 1840s saw the fastest territorial expansion in U.S. history. The annexation of Texas in 1845, adding a massive slaveholding territory, set off political alarms in the North. A year later, the Mexican-American War erupted. After 2 years of fighting, the U.S. emerged victorious, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848, handed over a vast swath of land, including what is now California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, and New Mexico. And again, the same question echoed through the halls of Congress. Would these new territories allow slavery? Abolitionist sentiment in the North surged as the spread of slavery threatened to turn a regional issue into a national crisis. In 1846, Representative David Wilmot introduced the Wilmot Proviso, a proposal to ban slavery in any territory acquired from Mexico. Though it failed to pass, it drew an even sharper line between North and South. Northern newspapers, pulpits, and town halls began to frame the struggle against slavery as a moral war. The South, however, was not backing down. Planters, politicians, and pro-slavery intellectuals argued that slavery was natural and essential to the national economy. A closed political and social system emerged, dominated by wealthy slaveholders who defended slavery not only through law, but through ideology. To them, any attack on slavery was an attack on the Southern way of life itself. Then came the California Gold Rush of 1848 to 1849. Hundreds of thousands of people poured into California, transforming it rapidly and leading to its application for statehood in 1850 as a free state. This alarmed the South, which feared losing its grip on the Senate. The political storm reached its peak with the Compromise of 1850. Brokered by Henry Clay, it was a last-ditch attempt to hold the Union together. California entered as a free state, while the remaining Mexican territories would determine slavery by popular sovereignty. But in exchange, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, forcing free states to help capture and return escaped slaves, a law that outraged the North and inflamed tensions further. By the end of the 1840s, the United States had grown larger, richer, and more connected than ever before, and also more fractured. The nation was no longer just debating policy, it was staring directly at the moral and political fault line that would define its future. After the Compromise of 1850, the United States wasn't truly at peace. It was only pausing at the edge of a gathering storm. The tensions that had long simmered beneath the surface were now undeniable, deep, and impossible to hide. North and South were not simply two regions with different economies. They represented two opposing systems of values. One side believed in free labor and industrial growth. The other clung to slavery as the foundation of its existence. The 1850s were not a quiet chapter. They were the tightening of a national fault line. Almost immediately after the Compromise, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 became the flashpoint for widespread social unrest. This law forced free states in the North to aid in the capture and return of escaped enslaved people to Southern owners. Worse still, it allowed Southern slave catchers to seize any black person without a formal trial. To many Northerners, this effectively turned the entire country into slave territory. Abolitionists reacted fiercely. Thousands joined the Underground Railroad, a secret network that helped enslaved people escape to the North and to Canada. Many northern towns openly defied the law, setting the stage for intense clashes between federal authorities and local communities. In this charged atmosphere, a book appeared in 1852 that shook the nation, Uncle Tom's Cabin, by Harriet Beecher Stowe. It portrayed the cruelty and inhumanity of slavery through the suffering of enslaved families. Over 300,000 copies were sold in its first year. For many Northerners, it was a moral wake-up call. For Southerners, it was a public insult. Literature had become a battlefield, and America was moving one step closer to division. Then came a political explosion. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, introduced by Stephen A. Douglas, allowed settlers in Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery, a policy called popular sovereignty. This effectively dismantled the boundary between slave and free states set by the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Kansas soon became a bloody battleground as pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces poured in. The violence that followed, known as Bleeding Kansas, was not a political debate anymore. It was war between citizens of the same nation. This decade also saw a seismic shift in American politics. The Whig Party, one of the two major political parties since the Jacksonian era, collapsed under the weight of the slavery issue. A new force emerged, the Republican Party, United States, founded in 1854 with a clear mission: to oppose the expansion of slavery into new territories. It grew rapidly in the North, becoming a direct political challenge to the power of the South. Tensions reached a new level in 1857 with the Supreme Court's ruling in Dred Scott v. Sandford. The Supreme Court of the United States declared that black people were not citizens, and that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in federal territories. The decision poured fuel on the fire, convincing many Northerners that the national political system was controlled by slave power. Then, in 1859, came a shock that echoed across the nation: John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. John Brown, abolitionist, a radical abolitionist, led a small group to seize the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, hoping to spark a massive slave uprising in the South. The raid failed, and Brown was captured and executed. But his act made him a symbol. In the North, many hailed him as a martyr. In the South, he became the embodiment of Northern threat. The moment John Brown climbed the gallows, the political tension of the nation felt ready to snap. The decade's climax came with the United States presidential election, 1860. Abraham Lincoln, representing the Republican Party, won the presidency without a single Southern electoral vote. To many Southerners, Lincoln's victory was a clear signal that slavery's future was in jeopardy. Just weeks after the election, South Carolina declared its secession from the Union, the first domino to fall. By the end of 1860, 6 more Southern states followed, forming the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as provisional president. A nation that had spent decades trying to hold itself together through uneasy compromises now stood divided in two. The storm that had long been brewing had finally broken. The United States was no longer one united nation. South Carolina declared its secession just weeks after Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Over the next 3 months, 6 more Southern states followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. In February 1861, they formed the Confederate States of America with Jefferson Davis as provisional president. A new nation had been born right in the heart of an existing one. On March 4, 1861, Lincoln gave his inaugural address in Washington, D.C. He didn't declare war, nor did he accept secession. Instead, he sent a calm but firm message: "We are not enemies, but friends." We must not be enemies, but the wheels of history had already started rolling down a slope that could not be reversed. At dawn on April 12, 1861, Confederate cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The bombardment lasted 34 hours, marking the official beginning of the American Civil War. The age of political debate and fragile compromise was over. This was the first gunfire between two governments claiming to exist on the same land. The war quickly spun beyond anyone's early expectations. Both sides believed it would be over in weeks. In reality, it dragged on for 4 brutal years and became the bloodiest conflict in American history. More than 600,000 people died, more than all other 19th-century American wars combined. In the early months, 4 additional states joined the Confederacy: Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. The Confederate capital was established in Richmond, Virginia, less than 100 miles from Washington. The dividing line was no longer a mark on a map. It was drawn with guns, blood, and the marching feet of armies moving through towns, fields, and forests of a torn country. The two sides' strategies reflected who they were. The North, under Lincoln, refused to recognize the Confederacy. Its initial goal wasn't to abolish slavery, but to preserve the Union. The main strategy, known as the Anaconda Plan, aimed to blockade southern ports and strangle the plantation economy that depended on cotton exports. The South, in contrast, bet everything on defending its ground, dragging the war out, and exhausting the North into accepting their independence. The First Battle of Bull Run, also called the First Battle of Manassas, on July 21, 1861, was the first real test. The North believed it would be a quick, decisive fight, but they were crushed. The world now saw that this war would not be short, and it would not be simple. In the early years, the South held strong military advantages with seasoned commanders like Robert E. Lee and Thomas Jonathan Jackson, Stonewall, and fierce cavalry units. The North, however, had the power of numbers and industry. While the South had around 9 million people, including 4 million enslaved, the North had over 22 million, a modern rail system, and overwhelming industrial capacity. Beyond America's borders, the world was watching closely. United Kingdom and the Second French Empire stayed officially neutral, but European textile industries relied heavily on southern cotton. The Confederacy hoped cotton diplomacy would push Europe to intervene. But the Union quickly adjusted politically and economically, and that strategy failed. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This document didn't immediately free all enslaved people, but it changed the heart of the war. What had begun as a fight to preserve the Union became a fight for freedom. From that moment on, the South was no longer just a secessionist movement. It was the defender of slavery. The North became the side standing for a future without chains. As the war raged on, the bloodshed deepened. The Battle of Antietam in 1862 was the bloodiest single day in American history. The Battle of Gettysburg in 1863 became a turning point as the South suffered a crushing defeat. That same year, at the Battle of Vicksburg, the North gained control of the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two. The tide of war shifted. The war also transformed American society. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved people escaped plantations, many joining the Union Army. Thousands of women in the North took on crucial roles in logistics and medical care. Industry and finance surged to support the war effort. The South, meanwhile, sank into economic collapse, runaway inflation, food shortages, and war fatigue. By 1864, Lincoln had been re-elected, and Ulysses S. Grant had become commander of all Union forces. The war moved toward its brutal end with Sherman's march to the sea, when Northern forces swept through the South, destroying infrastructure and cutting supply lines. On April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, General Lee surrendered to Grant. The Civil War was over. The Confederacy was gone. The Union stood again, but it was no longer the same country. Over 600,000 lives had been lost. Millions of families were broken, southern cities lay in ruins, and its economy was shattered. Yet from those ashes, slavery was abolished, and a new chapter in the American story began. 4 years of war had taken more than 600,000 lives, left millions wounded, and turned much of the South into ashes. Geographically, the nation was reunited, but politically, socially, and in spirit, it was more deeply divided than ever before. Just days after victory, another shock struck the country. On April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., by John Wilkes Booth, an extremist Southern sympathizer. Lincoln's death left the nation without its steady hand at the very moment it needed healing the most. His successor, Andrew Johnson, would have to lead a country standing at a crossroads of history. The program of Reconstruction began in 1865 with two central goals: bringing the Southern states back into the Union and rebuilding Southern society on a new foundation, one without slavery. It was never going to be an easy process. Though the South had lost the war, its social structure remained deeply entrenched, with power concentrated in the hands of white plantation elites. In December 1865, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified, abolishing slavery across the nation. Over 4 million enslaved people were declared free. But freedom did not mean equality. They had no land, no property, no education, and their new lives began in poverty, surrounded by a society that often met them with bitter hostility. President Johnson, a Southern Unionist, pursued a lenient Reconstruction policy. He quickly issued pardons to many former Confederate leaders and allowed the Southern states to rejoin the Union with few conditions. This angered many Northerners who feared that the old planter class would quickly regain political power and rebuild a new racial hierarchy. In response, a Republican-controlled Congress took a harder line. In 1867, the Reconstruction Acts were passed. The South was divided into 5 military districts placed under Union Army control. Southern states would only be readmitted if they ratified the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, 1868, which granted citizenship and equal legal protection to anyone born or naturalized in the United States, including Black Americans. For the first time in American history, hundreds of thousands of black men gained the right to vote and participate in political life. Many became delegates, legislators, and even state governors. Hiram Rhodes Revels became the first black U.S. senator in 1870. It was a historic breakthrough, but it also sparked a fierce backlash. Black freedom meant a loss of power for the Southern white elite. Secret groups emerged to reclaim their dominance, the most infamous being the Ku Klux Klan, founded in 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee. Beneath their white hoods, Klan members carried out terror campaigns, burning homes, lynching, and attacking black people and their allies. In many rural areas of the South, nightfall became something to fear. The federal government responded with the Enforcement Acts, 1870 to 1871, authorizing the use of the army to prosecute violent groups and protect black citizens. But resistance never fully disappeared. Southern legislatures passed local laws known as black codes, designed to restrict freedom of movement and economic independence, effectively pushing many freed people back into systems of control. Reconstruction was not only about politics and civil rights, it was also about rebuilding an economy shattered by war. Plantations were abandoned, rail lines were destroyed, and agricultural output collapsed. Federal authorities and aid groups, including the Freedmen's Bureau, worked to teach newly freed people to read, find work, and build new lives. Hundreds of schools were established, and thousands of Northern teachers traveled south to educate black communities. This became the beginning of a broader movement for education among African Americans, yet progress was met with relentless opposition and chronic lack of resources. A new system known as sharecropping emerged, trapping many black families in cycles of debt and dependency on white landowners. They were no longer slaves by law, but their lives were still tightly bound by economic chains. By the mid-1870s, the North was growing weary of Reconstruction. The economic depression of 1873 shifted public attention toward domestic hardship rather than the South's future. Meanwhile, Southern Democrats regained control of many state governments and began tightening restrictions on black citizens. In 1877, a behind-the-scenes political deal, the Compromise of 1877, brought Reconstruction to an end. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South in exchange for Republican control of the White House after the contested 1876 election. Once the soldiers left, the fragile rights that black Americans had gained began to erode rapidly in the decades that followed. Reconstruction left a complicated legacy. It was a time when the United States tried for the first time to build a more equal society after centuries of slavery. But it was also a time of fierce backlash and determined efforts to undo those gains. Though it lasted less than 15 years, it planted seeds for both hope and division that would shape the nation for centuries to come. As the 19th century moved into its latter half, the United States stood as a unified nation on the map. But beneath the surface, the wounds of civil war and Reconstruction still burned. The struggle over citizenship, equality, and national identity was far from over. It was only beginning a new chapter. After the Compromise of 1877, the United States officially closed the chapter on Reconstruction and stepped into a new era, at the age of industrialization. The cotton fields of the South, once the heart of the national economy, slowly gave way to the factories of the North, the railroads stretching across the continent, and cities rising like forests after a rainstorm. In less than 25 years, the nation transformed from an agricultural society into an emerging industrial superpower. By the end of the 19th century, the U.S. economy was growing at one of the fastest rates in the world. Between 1870 and 1900, industrial output increased more than sixfold. Steel, coal, oil, and railroads became the four pillars of this new economic age. If the pre-Civil War era was the age of cotton, this was the age of steel and steam. Nothing captured this transformation more powerfully than the railroads. After the American Civil War, the U.S. rail network exploded. In 1869, a symbolic moment arrived with the completion of the first transcontinental railroad at Promontory Summit in the Utah Territory. The final golden spike was driven into the tracks, a declaration that America was now truly connected from the Atlantic to the Pacific. By 1900, the nation's railroads stretched over 300,000 kilometers. Trains carried steel, goods, crops, and people across the continent. Cities like Chicago, St. Louis, and San Francisco boomed because of their location along key trade routes. The railroad was more than infrastructure. It was a machine that created a national market, breaking down the regional divisions that had defined the country before the Civil War. Railroads drove massive demand for steel, coal, and oil. This was the age of colossal corporations and the rise of the so-called robber barons. Andrew Carnegie built a steel empire in Pittsburgh and became one of the wealthiest men in the world. John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil in 1870, dominating the oil industry through total control of production and distribution. Cornelius Vanderbilt expanded his railroad empire, while J.P. Morgan emerged as a powerful financial titan, channeling capital into America's industrial growth. This was also a period of technological revolution. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, ushering in a new era of communication. In 1879, Thomas Edison introduced the commercial light bulb and founded Edison Electric Light Company, bringing electricity into urban life. These innovations didn't just transform industries, they changed how people lived, spoke, and worked. Industrialization unleashed an unprecedented wave of urbanization. In 1860, only about 20% of Americans lived in cities. By 1900, that number had nearly tripled. New York City, Chicago, and Philadelphia grew into bustling metropolises with electric lights, subways, skyscrapers, and millions packed into working-class neighborhoods. At the same time, a massive wave of immigration flowed into the United States. Between 1870 and 1900, more than 12 million immigrants, mainly from Germany, Ireland, Italy, Poland, and Eastern Europe, arrived, many through Ellis Island, which became a symbol of the American dream. But reality was not always kind. Overcrowded tenements, brutal working conditions, meager wages, and discrimination shaped daily life for millions of laborers. As factories multiplied, working conditions grew harsher. Laborers often worked 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week in dangerous environments. Women and children made up a large portion of the industrial workforce, but were paid far less than men. Out of this inequality, the first organized labor movements emerged. Knights of Labor was founded in 1869 as the first national labor organization, calling for better working conditions and shorter hours. In 1886, a massive protest in Chicago at the Haymarket Affair ended in violence and government crackdowns, but it marked a turning point toward organized labor action. Strikes, marches, and collective bargaining began to shape the social fabric of late 19th century America. This was also a time when economic inequality became sharper than ever before. While a small group of industrial tycoons amassed unimaginable wealth, millions struggled in poverty. Writer Mark Twain famously dubbed the era the Gilded Age, a tale of today, a period glittering with surface prosperity but rotting with inequality underneath. The new industrial capitalist class built networks of power that reached deep into politics. Corruption, bribery, and election manipulation were common in major cities. Political machines like Tammany Hall in New York became infamous symbols of backroom power. And yet, this was the era that laid the foundation for America's rise as a global power. Modern infrastructure, a massive labor force, booming industry, and rapid technological innovation pushed the nation onto the world stage, rivaling United Kingdom and the German Empire. The United States was no longer just a vast country. It was becoming a mechanized economic giant capable of shaping the world order in the century to come. As the 19th century drew to a close, train whistles echoed across the land, electric lights illuminated growing cities, factories roared day and night, and wave after wave of immigrants poured in. America entered the 20th century not as a nation recovering from war, but as a rising power, a country defined by both its dazzling promise and its deep inequalities. The concept of manifest destiny had once inspired the United States to expand its territory from the Atlantic to the Pacific during the 19th century. But by the end of the century, that idea took on a new shape. America's destiny was no longer confined to the continent, it stretched across the oceans. One of the most influential voices behind this shift was Alfred Thayer Mahan, author of The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783, 1890. He argued that whoever rules the seas rules the world. His ideas quickly spread through America's political, military, and commercial circles. The ocean was no longer just a route for trade. It became the pathway to global power. This was also the moment when the United States began building a modern navy. From a modest force, it grew rapidly, and by the early 20th century, the United States Navy had become one of the most powerful in the world, second only to the Royal Navy of the United Kingdom. In 1898, an event changed America's place on the world stage, the Spanish-American War. The spark was Cuba, where a rebellion had broken out against Spanish rule. The United States, proclaiming its support for Cuban independence, intervened after the mysterious explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898, which killed more than 260 sailors. The American press, especially the New York Journal, fueled public outrage, pushing the country toward war. The war itself was swift. Within months, the United States achieved a decisive victory. The U.S. Navy destroyed the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay in the Philippines and seized strategic positions. The Treaty of Paris, 1898, ended the war, with Spain ceding Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. Cuba became officially independent, but in reality it remained under Washington's heavy influence. The victory carried profound meaning. The United States had become an imperial power. For the first time in its history, it held overseas territories, strategic bases, and a position in global power politics. America was no longer standing on the sidelines of world affairs. Earlier, in 1893, pro-American business interests had overthrown the monarchy of Hawaii. In 1898, during the war with Spain, the US formally annexed the islands. Hawaii became a crucial strategic base in the middle of the Pacific, a key hub for trade, naval power, and political influence in the Asia-Pacific region. From that point on, the United States began shaping a Pacific strategy. The Philippines, Hawaii, and Guam became its Pacific gateways, opening the door to a global role. Meanwhile, China was being carved into spheres of influence by European powers and the Empire of Japan. With enormous economic power but without a traditional colonial empire, the United States chose a different path, the Open Door Policy, 1899. Initiated by Secretary of State John Hay, it called on nations to keep trade in China open to all. The goal was not altruism, it was to secure access to the Chinese market without having to seize colonies. This policy strengthened America's influence in the Asia-Pacific and cemented its status as a global trading power. In the early 20th century, the US continued modernizing its navy. In 1907, President Theodore Roosevelt launched the Great White Fleet, 16 gleaming white battleships on a 14-month voyage around the world. The mission wasn't to fight, but to show off American strength to the great powers of Europe. It was a clear signal the United States was no longer just a defensive nation. It was a major player on the world stage, standing alongside Britain, France, Russia, and Germany. At the same time, the United States expanded its influence in Latin America. Building on the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which opposed European intervention in the Americas, Roosevelt added the Roosevelt Corollary in 1904, asserting the U.S. right to intervene in Latin American countries to maintain stability. Washington frequently sent troops or exerted political pressure across the region. One of the most strategic projects of this era was the Panama Canal. After supporting Panama's separation from Colombia in 1903, the United States secured the rights to build and control the canal linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Completed in 1914, the canal became a vital artery of global trade and a cornerstone of American strategic power. By 1914, the United States controlled or held influence over key territories around the world: Hawaii, Guam, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, along with strategic bases and a strong presence in Latin America and Asia. It was not yet an empire in the traditional sense of Britain or France, but in practice, America had built a modern empire, one founded on trade, naval power, and geopolitical strategy. In the summer of 1914, gunfire in Sarajevo ignited the greatest conflict the world had ever seen: World War I. As the great powers of Europe plunged into total war, the United States, a young industrial power across the Atlantic, initially chose to remain on the sidelines, watching and weighing its options. But whether it wanted to or not, America's rapid growth over the previous 3 decades had tied its fate to the global network. Inevitably, the war would pull the nation into the center of world history. When the war began, President Woodrow Wilson declared that the United States would remain neutral, refusing to intervene in what he called a European war. But neutrality did not mean isolation. American industry and agriculture quickly became a massive supply base for the allies of World War I, United Kingdom, Third French Republic, and the Russian Empire. Millions of tons of wheat, steel, weapons, medicine, and war supplies crossed the Atlantic. American banks, especially financial groups led by J.P. Morgan, loaned billions of dollars to the Allies to sustain their war efforts. Meanwhile, trade with the German Empire nearly collapsed under the British naval blockade. Although Washington had not yet declared war, in practice the United States was already leaning toward the Allied side. The war at sea became the critical factor, drawing America closer to the conflict. In response to the blockade, Germany unleashed its U-boats, submarines, to sink any supply ship bound for Britain. On May 7, 1915, the passenger ship RMS Lusitania was torpedoed off Old Head of Kinsale, killing more than 1,190 people, including 128 Americans. The attack sent shockwaves through U.S. public opinion. While Washington still held back from declaring war, the idea of neutrality began to crack. Tensions escalated in the following years. Germany promised to restrict submarine warfare, then broke that promise in early 1917, betting it could strangle Britain before the US intervened. Around the same time, American intelligence intercepted the Zimmermann telegram, a secret German proposal to Mexico for a military alliance against the US. When the telegram was made public, outrage swept the nation. On April 2, 1917, President Wilson addressed the United States Congress, declaring that America must make the world safe for democracy. 4 days later, the United States declared war on Germany. This was more than a military decision. It was a historic turning point, ending nearly a century of avoiding major European wars. At first, the US Army was small compared to the massive forces already fighting in Europe, but the nation's industrial and economic power was unmatched. Within a year, over 4 million Americans had been mobilized, and 2 million were sent overseas. It was one of the largest military mobilizations in U.S. history up to that point. The American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, led by John J. Pershing, entered combat on the Western Front in 1918. Battles like the Battle of Cantigny, Second Battle of the Marne, and Meuse-Argonne offensive helped tip the balance of the war. While the Central Powers were exhausted by years of fighting, America was just beginning to unleash its strength. Beyond its military contribution, the US brought an enormous psychological boost to the Allies. When Berlin realized it could not win against a vast industrial superpower across the Atlantic, the outcome became inevitable. On November 11, 1918, the guns fell silent across the Western Front. Germany signed an armistice, ending 4 years of brutal warfare that had killed more than 16 million people and wounded over 20 million more. The United States stood among the victors and at the center of global power. After the war, Wilson carried with him a grand vision for a new international order built on cooperation and the rule of law. In January 1918, he had unveiled the 14 points, a blueprint for lasting peace, disarmament, national self-determination, and the creation of an international organization to prevent future wars. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, Wilson became a central figure. While Britain and France pushed to punish Germany, US influence was undeniable. Out of Wilson's vision came the League of Nations, the first global organization aimed at preserving peace. But a deep irony followed. While Wilson wanted the United States to lead this new world order, Congress and the American public rejected binding foreign commitments. The prevailing mood after the war was to return to normalcy and avoid foreign entanglements. In 1920, the U.S. Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, and the United States did not join the very League of Nations it had helped create. This revealed the dual nature of America at the time, a global superpower with overwhelming strength, yet still bound by its long tradition of isolationism. Even so, its international position had changed forever. From an outsider, the US had become a nation the rest of the world had to reckon with in every major political and economic calculation. World War I was more than just a war. It was a global turning point. Old empires collapsed, the world map was redrawn, and the United States emerged as a central actor on the world stage. America could no longer be just a nation across the ocean. It had become a global power. When the guns of World War I fell silent, the United States stepped into a new era with the confidence of a victor. Unlike the war-torn European powers, America returned home in glory, richer, stronger, and more self-assured than ever. The 1920s opened like a golden picture, booming economic growth, technological innovations transforming daily life and a dazzling new popular culture. Right after the war, the US went through a brief period of adjustment, then surged forward at breakneck speed. National output grew more than 40% in a single decade. Industrial production, especially automobiles, electricity, and steel, became the backbone of the economy. Ford Motor Company, founded by Henry Ford, led the way with the Ford Model T, a low-cost car produced on modern assembly lines. By 1927, 1 in every 5 Americans owned an automobile, something unimaginable just a few years earlier. Electricity also became a staple of daily life. Electric lights, refrigerators, washing machines, and radios, once luxuries, found their way into millions of homes. The economy wasn't just growing in factories, it was reaching into every kitchen and living room, reshaping how people lived and experienced the world. On New York Stock Exchange, the market soared. More and more Americans invested, convinced they had found a quick path to wealth. The financial streets of New York City became symbols of prosperity as stock prices climbed steadily, feeding a widespread belief that the good times would never end. If the 19th century was the age of factories, the 1920s was the age of music, cinema, and personal freedom. This was the era of jazz, a sound full of rebellion, vitality, and youth. New Orleans became its birthplace, where black musicians like Louis Armstrong transformed global music. The sound of saxophones and trumpets filled bars and clubs and flowed out through radios nationwide. Hollywood entered its golden age. The city became the world's film capital, with stars like Charlie Chaplin and Clara Bow enchanting millions. Silent films dominated theaters until 1927, when the jazz singer introduced audiences to talkies, launching modern cinema. Radio became the most powerful mass media platform of its time. In 1920, KDKA in Pittsburgh aired the first commercial broadcast. Just a decade later, millions of families owned radios. For the first time in history, America shared a single cultural space. People across distant states could listen, laugh, and sing together. One of the most profound shifts of the decade was the changing role of women. The 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, ratified in 1920, granted women the right to vote nationwide. No longer confined to traditional domestic roles, women entered universities, the workforce, politics, and most visibly, public life. The image of the flapper, young women with short bobbed hair, short dresses, cigarettes in hand, and the Charleston on their lips, became a symbol of rebellion and personal freedom. It wasn't just fashion, it was a cultural statement that the old world was changing, but not everyone embraced these changes. A powerful conservative backlash emerged, especially in the South and rural areas. The Ku Klux Klan was reborn, growing to millions of members by the mid-1920s, targeting not only black Americans but also immigrants, Jews, Catholics, and liberals. One of the most controversial policies of the era was prohibition in the United States. The nationwide ban on producing, selling, and consuming alcohol, enacted in 1920 through the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Though presented as a moral and social reform, prohibition created a vast underground world. Alcohol didn't disappear, it went underground. Speakeasies popped up everywhere. Organized crime syndicates thrived, smuggling and distributing alcohol for enormous profits. Al Capone rose to power in Chicago, becoming one of the most infamous gangsters of the era, controlling not just the illegal liquor trade, but parts of local politics. Instead of making society more moral, prohibition fueled the rise of organized crime. Even with its global economic strength after World War I, the dominant mood in 1920s America was isolationism. Americans wanted to return to normalcy, avoiding foreign entanglements. In 1921, the US signed naval limitation treaties but refused to join the League of Nations. Congress passed restrictive immigration laws aimed at limiting arrivals from Southern and Eastern Europe, reflecting deep anxieties and prejudice toward outsiders. The 1920s glittered with opportunity, freedom, and innovation. But beneath the shine, powerful tensions were already beginning to build. In the fall of 1929, Wall Street in New York City still glittered under bright lights. Investors packed in front of ticker boards, profit reports glowed with optimism, and dreams of endless wealth floated through the air like loose stock slips in the wind. America believed the boom would never end, but history often takes its sharpest turns when confidence turns into illusion. On October 24, 1929, a day that would be remembered as Black Thursday, the stock market began to freefall. Millions of shares were dumped in panic, triggering a devastating chain reaction. 5 days later, on October 29th, Black Tuesday, 1929, more than 16 million shares were sold in a frenzy, wiping out tens of billions of dollars in just a few hours. This collapse didn't just devastate big speculators. Millions of ordinary Americans, people who had borrowed to buy stocks, lost their life savings overnight. Banks, which had recklessly lent during the boom years, began to fall like dominoes. Between 1930 and 1933, more than 9,000 banks in the United States went under. In just a few short years, the prosperity of the Roaring Twenties became a distant memory. National output plummeted nearly 30%, an unprecedented drop. Unemployment soared from 3% in 1929 to over 25% by 1933. More than 13 million Americans lost their jobs. Long lines of the unemployed stretched through the streets of Chicago, Detroit, and New York City, a haunting image of the era. Makeshift shantytowns sprang up everywhere, bitterly nicknamed Hoovervilles after President Herbert Hoover, who was blamed for failing to act. Millions of farmers lost their land as crop prices collapsed. In the Great Plains, an environmental disaster struck, the Dust Bowl. Giant dust storms swept across Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas, stripping the soil bare. Hundreds of thousands of farm families fled their homes, becoming wanderers in their own country. President Hoover believed the economy would heal itself without government interference. The long-held faith in laissez-faire economics was suddenly powerless in the face of such deep crisis. His small, piecemeal relief efforts did little to ease the suffering of millions. Meanwhile, public trust in the financial system collapsed. People rushed to withdraw their savings, pushing fragile banks to the brink. Each bank failure meant that entire communities lost their savings overnight. A nation once proud of its prosperity was now trapped in hunger, poverty, and despair. The United States presidential election, 1932, became a turning point. Americans had lost faith in Hoover. In this dark atmosphere, Franklin D. Roosevelt, the governor of New York, emerged as a beacon of hope. Promising a New Deal for the American people, he won by a landslide. On March 4, 1933, Roosevelt took the oath of office. His inaugural address echoed like a call to arms against despair. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. It was more than a line. It was the beginning of a bold experiment in how a nation could fight economic collapse. In his first 100 days, Roosevelt launched a sweeping series of programs that came to be known collectively as the New Deal. New agencies were born overnight. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, put young men to work on public projects. The Public Works Administration, PWA, and Works Progress Administration, WPA, built roads, bridges, dams, and schools across the country. The banking system was overhauled. The Emergency Banking Act stabilized the financial sector. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, was created to insure deposits. The Securities Act of 1933 and Securities Exchange Act of 1934 established federal oversight to prevent unregulated speculation. Most transformative of all, the Social Security Act of 1935 created America's first national social safety net, providing unemployment benefits and pensions for the elderly. For the first time, the federal government assumed direct responsibility for protecting citizens from economic catastrophe. These programs didn't end the Great Depression overnight, but they restored hope. Unemployed workers found jobs building infrastructure that would shape the nation's future. Bridges, dams, and highways rose out of despair, and with them, a renewed sense that the government was not powerless. Not everyone welcomed the New Deal. Big business leaders accused Roosevelt of being too radical, while voices on the left said he hadn't gone far enough. But Roosevelt had redefined the relationship between government and the American people. By the late 1930s, the U.S. economy was slowly recovering. Unemployment fell, industrial output climbed. Yet it would not be the New Deal alone that finally pulled America out of the Depression. That final push would come with the gathering storm overseas. When World War II erupted in 1939, America's factories would roar back to life, not for speculation, but for war. When World War II erupted on September 1, 1939, with Nazi Germany invading Poland, the United States was still recovering from the Great Depression. While Europe plunged into war, the U.S., under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, declared neutrality. After years of hardship, most Americans wanted no part in another conflict across the ocean. But history has a way of pulling bystanders into its current, and the United States, with its massive economic strength, would soon become the pivotal force in the war. In the early years of the conflict, the U.S. passed neutrality acts to avoid repeating the path that had led it into World War I. Yet Roosevelt knew America couldn't remain on the sidelines forever. When United Kingdom faced a fight for survival after the fall of France in 1940, Washington began supplying the Allies with weapons, food, and fuel through the Lend-Lease Act, 1941. American convoys crossed the Atlantic loaded with tanks, planes, ammunition, and supplies, even as the U.S. officially remained neutral. This lifeline kept the Allies from collapsing under the relentless assault of the Wehrmacht. Then came December 7, 1941. The skies over Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, exploded in flames as aircraft from the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack. More than 2,400 Americans were killed, and much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet was destroyed. The next morning, President Roosevelt addressed the United States Congress, declaring December 7th a date which will live in infamy. On December 8, 1941, the United States declared war on the Empire of Japan. 3 days later, Nazi Germany and the Kingdom of Italy declared war on the U.S. In a single moment, America was no longer a bystander. It was a leader in the greatest conflict of its time. Unlike war-weary Europe, the U.S. entered the war with the world's most powerful industrial base and a united society forged through the hardships of the 1930s. Roosevelt and the federal government quickly shifted the entire economy to a wartime footing. Automobile factories began producing tanks and aircraft. Assembly lines for household goods turned out rifles, shells, and bombs. During the war, the U.S. produced more than 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, and millions of tons of munitions, more than any other nation. From the ruins of Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy grew into the most powerful naval force in the world in just a few years. The mobilization extended far beyond factories. More than 16 million Americans served in the armed forces, with over 11 million deployed overseas. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter, the strong, determined face of the home front. Strategically, the U.S. adopted a Europe-first policy. defeat Nazi Germany before turning full force to Asia. In Europe, American forces joined major campaigns from Operation Torch, North Africa, 1942, to the Italian campaign, World War II, 1943. The turning point came on June 6, 1944, Normandy landings known as D-Day, when more than 150,000 Allied troops, including tens of thousands of Americans, stormed the beaches of Normandy, France, opening the road to the heart of Germany. In the Pacific, the US faced a determined enemy willing to fight to the death. From the Battle of Midway, 1942, where US forces crippled the Japanese fleet, to the Battle of Iwo Jima, 1945, brutal island campaigns turned the tide. American industrial might and naval supremacy eventually overwhelmed Japan. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 superfortress named Enola Gay dropped the world's first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. These remain the only nuclear weapons ever used in war. The destruction forced Japan to surrender unconditionally on August 15, 1945, bringing World War II to an end. When the smoke cleared, the world had changed forever. Europe and Asia lay in ruins, but the United States emerged with the strongest economy, the most powerful military, and the most advanced weaponry on Earth. From a nation that had once stepped back after World War I, the US now stood at the center of a new global order. In July 1944, at the Bretton Woods Conference, the US led the creation of a new international financial system, giving birth to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. The US dollar became the world's primary reserve currency. In October 1945, the United Nations was established with its headquarters in New York City. America was a founding member and a driving force in shaping its structure and principles. In its hands was not only the atomic bomb, but the power to shape the post-war world. As millions of soldiers returned home, the nation entered an unprecedented economic boom. The GY Bill gave veterans access to college education, home ownership, and new opportunities. Suburbs flourished, the middle class expanded, and faith in the future became part of the American identity. After the war, the Soviet Union moved quickly to expand its influence across Eastern Europe. From Poland to Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and East Germany, communist governments loyal to Moscow were established one after another. Meanwhile, the United States strengthened its alliances in Western Europe, supporting economic recovery and building a shared defense structure. The Iron Curtain fell just as Winston Churchill described in his famous 1946 speech in Fulton. An iron curtain has descended across the continent. This was the moment the world officially entered a bipolar era, a time when every nation, big or small, would inevitably be pulled into the orbit of one of two superpowers. The US responded quickly with the Marshall Plan, 1948, a massive economic aid program that pumped more than $13 billion into countries like France, Italy, and West Germany. It helped rebuild Western Europe at remarkable speed and reduce the spread of communism. This wasn't just about economics. It was a calculated geopolitical move to build a strong ring of allies to counter the Soviet Union. The following year, the United States and 11 other countries formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, 1949. This military alliance came with a collective defense clause. If one member was attacked, all would respond together. It became the Western world's shield against Soviet power. One of the first major crises of the Cold War unfolded in Berlin. In 1948, the Soviets blockaded all land and rail access to West Berlin, trying to force the Western powers to abandon the city. The US answered with the Berlin Airlift, an enormous operation flying food, fuel, and medicine into the besieged city. Over 11 months, American planes made more than 200,000 flights, sustaining millions of civilians. The blockade ended in failure for Moscow and cemented America's position in Europe. In 1945, the United States was the only country with nuclear weapons. But by 1949, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb, launching a dangerous arms race. Both sides began stockpiling thousands of nuclear warheads, building intercontinental ballistic missiles, strategic bombers, and nuclear submarines. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, mutual guaranteed annihilation, became the fragile foundation of global stability. In 1952, the US tested the first hydrogen bomb, hundreds of times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The Soviets followed in 1953. The world had entered an era in which a single push of a button could end human civilization. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth. The news shook America. Washington responded by founding the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, in 1958, kicking off the space race between the two superpowers. More than a decade later, on July 20, 1969, NASA astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first human to set foot on the Moon during Apollo 11. His words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," became a symbol of America's triumph in the space race. The Cold War never exploded into direct war between the US and the Soviet Union, but it spread through a series of proxy wars and high-stakes confrontations across continents. 1950. The Korean War broke out when North Korea invaded South Korea. The US led United Nations forces to push back, and the war dragged on until 1953, reinforcing East-West tensions in Asia. 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world closer to nuclear war than ever before when the Soviets deployed missiles in Cuba. A tense standoff between John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev ended with a last-minute deal, avoiding catastrophe. 1960s to 1970s. The Vietnam War saw deep US involvement to stop the spread of communism. It became a long, painful conflict that deeply divided American society. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, after decades of tension, the two superpowers entered a period of détente, a deliberate easing of hostilities. Agreements like the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT I, 1972, aimed to curb parts of the nuclear arms race. That same year, President Richard Nixon made historic visits to Moscow and Beijing, reshaping global diplomacy. Even though tensions continued, the United States held the economic and technological edge. The Soviet Union, weighed down by a stagnant economy and decades of military buildup, began to falter. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he launched perestroika and glasnost reforms. But they came too late to save a crumbling empire. On November 9, 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall marked the symbolic end of the Cold War in Europe. 2 years later, on December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. After nearly half a century of confrontation, the Cold War was over and the United States emerged as the world's sole superpower. The Cold War ended without a single global war, but it shaped almost every aspect of the modern world: political, military, cultural, and technological. From Berlin to Cuba, from Vietnam to outer space, from nuclear weapons to the birth of the Internet, the imprint of this great rivalry remains everywhere. When the Soviet Union officially collapsed on December 26, 1991, the world suddenly became a stage with only one star shining at its center. After more than 4 decades locked in the tense standoff of the Cold War, the United States emerged as an unrivaled superpower, a position no nation in modern history had ever held so completely. This was the beginning of what observers called a unipolar world. the United States didn't just lead in military power, it dominated in economics, culture, technology, and diplomacy. The 1990s became one of the clearest eras marked by what many called American power. The expansion of a new world order. When the fall of the Berlin Wall opened new borders, countries across Eastern Europe quickly broke away from Moscow's orbit. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and the European Union expanded eastward as Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic gradually integrated into the Western system. In many places, capitalism and liberal democracy were embraced as the inevitable path to the future. In this atmosphere, the US positioned itself as the architect of a new global order, aiming to set shared principles rooted in free trade, democracy, and technology. Globalization was no longer just an economic concept. It became the defining idea of an entire era. The Internet revolution and economic boom. The 1990s witnessed the explosive rise of information technology and the Internet. In 1991, the World Wide Web was made public. In less than a decade, it spread across the globe, transforming how people communicated, worked, and experienced the world. American tech companies like Microsoft, Apple, Yahoo, and later Google became global icons. Personal computers, cell phones, email, and web browsers, once tools for scientists, became part of daily life for millions. This technological boom helped propel the US economy to unprecedented growth. By the late 1990s, America entered the longest economic expansion in its modern history. Productivity surged, unemployment fell, and the stock market soared to record highs. President Bill Clinton, who served from 1993 to 2001, led the country during this prosperous period. His administration pursued free trade and deeper global integration. In 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, was signed between the US, Canada, and Mexico, creating one of the largest free trade zones in the world. The US also played a key role in founding the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 1995, marking a major milestone in global economic integration. Goods, capital, and ideas flowed more freely than ever before. American corporations expanded worldwide, while US products and culture, from Hollywood films to fast food, became omnipresent symbols of this new global era. To American culture as a global phenomenon. The 1990s was also the decade when American pop culture swept across the globe. Pop music, cinema, television, fashion, and sports carried a distinctly American flair. Artists like Michael Jackson, Madonna, and Whitney Houston, followed by a new wave of performers, became international icons. Hollywood blockbusters such as Titanic, 1997, Jurassic Park, 1993, and The Matrix, 1999, didn't just dominate US theaters, they conquered screens worldwide. The McDonald's chain expanded to dozens of countries, becoming one of the clearest symbols of American-style globalization. This was a time when the American dream wasn't just a national idea anymore. It became a global image of prosperity, opportunity, and modernity, unmatched military power. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States became the only nation capable of projecting strategic power across the globe. Just months before the USSR's dissolution, in 1991, the US showcased its military dominance during the Gulf War, leading an international coalition to defeat the Iraqi armed forces of Saddam Hussein in Kuwait in just 6 weeks. The war demonstrated overwhelming advantages: precision-guided weapons, unmatched air power, and real-time battlefield intelligence. With no equal on the global stage, the US could project its military force anywhere on Earth with unmatched speed and power. a bold vision of the future. The 1990s were also a time of sweeping declarations about the direction of humanity. Political scientist Francis Fukuyama published The End of History and the Last Man in 1992, arguing that with the fall of the Soviet Union, liberal democracy and capitalism would dominate the world, and that major ideological conflicts had come to an end. Confident in its global role, the US embraced the position of guardian of the world order. Military interventions in Somalia, 1992, Bosnia and Herzegovina, 1995, and Kosovo, 1999, reflected a belief that American power could shape the outcomes of international conflicts. Cracks beneath the surface. Beneath this confidence, however, deep fractures were forming. Globalization brought massive wealth to corporations and urban middle classes, but many traditional working-class communities in America felt left behind. Factories moved overseas, capital flowed beyond borders, and global competition eroded parts of the nation's industrial base. At the same time, America's expanding influence stirred resentment in parts of the world. In 1998, terrorist attacks on US embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam signaled the rise of a new global threat: terrorism. In the shadows, forces opposing American dominance were quietly growing. America at its peak. By the end of the 1990s, the United States appeared to stand at the height of its power. The economy was booming, its military unmatched, its technology leading the world, and its culture spreading to every corner of the globe. For many, this felt like a golden age of post-Cold War America. But history rarely moves in a straight line. Just a few years later, the world would be shaken by a single event that would change everything. On the morning of September 11, 2001, the sky over New York City was crystal clear. People were heading to work like any other day. No one knew that within less than 2 hours, the course of American history and the history of the entire world would change forever. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. 17 minutes later, United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 hit the Pentagon, the heart of America's military command. And finally, United Airlines Flight 93 went down in a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, after passengers fought back with extraordinary courage. 4 coordinated attacks carried out by members of Al-Qaeda took the lives of nearly 3,000 people. The black smoke curling into the Manhattan sky, the Twin Towers collapsing in fire, people running through the streets covered in ash. These images became carved into the collective memory of an entire nation. In an instant, the United States, a superpower once thought untouchable, realized it could be struck at home. September 11th was more than a national tragedy. It was a psychological turning point. There was no longer a safe distance between America and the rest of the world. The enemy was no longer a single nation, but a global terrorist network that was invisible, borderless, and did not follow the rules of traditional war. Just hours after the attacks, President George W. Bush addressed the nation. "We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them." It was a clear message. The United States would respond with full force. The beginning of a new war. Less than a month later, on October 7, 2001, the US launched the war in Afghanistan, the largest American military operation since the World War II. The goal was to overthrow the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, which had sheltered Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda network. US Special Forces, working with NATO allies and local resistance groups, quickly drove the Taliban out of major cities like Kabul. But this was not a conventional war. The enemy had no clear borders, no standing army, no fixed capital. What began as a military campaign soon turned into a long, diffuse war on terror that blurred the line between battlefield and homeland. Security at home. Transformed inside the United States, the government carried out sweeping security reforms unlike anything since World War II. In October 2001, the USA Patriot Act was passed, expanding the government's authority to monitor communications, collect intelligence, and detain individuals suspected of terrorist ties. In 2002, the United States Department of Homeland Security was created, reshaping the entire domestic security infrastructure. Airports adopted strict security procedures. International travel, communications, and even online activity came under tighter surveillance. Fear became a constant presence in American life. Expanding the war. Iraq. In March 2003, the Bush administration expanded the war on terror with the Iraq War. The justification was that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and had ties to al-Qaeda. Although no conclusive evidence was ever found, the military campaign went forward. Within weeks, US and coalition forces toppled Saddam's regime. But early victory quickly gave way to chaos, insurgency, sectarian violence, terrorism, and the rise of new extremist groups. The Iraq War deeply divided the American public and damaged Washington's image abroad. The United States, once seen as the guardian of world order, began to be viewed by many as a superpower acting unilaterally. A global response and growing controversy. The events of September 11th reshaped America's relationship with the world. Washington expanded security partnerships with dozens of countries, built a broader global military footprint, and carried out counter-terrorism operations from Pakistan and Yemen to Philippines and the Horn of Africa. But drone strikes, covert missions, and the detention of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay Naval Base sparked fierce debates over human rights and international law. Many nations and global organizations began to question the way the US exercised its power. A nation forever changed. September 11th did not just launch wars overseas, it reshaped the American mind. In the early months, the country stood united, but fear and a sense of lost safety began to settle in. Patriotism surged, yet suspicion and polarization grew. Debates erupted over the balance between national security and individual liberty, a tension that would shape American politics for decades to come. The United States remained the world's leading military and economic power, but the long wars in Afghanistan and Iraq drained its resources and tested its resolve. At the same time, new challenges emerged, especially the rapid rise of China, signaling the beginning of a more complex and competitive geopolitical era. At the dawn of the 21st century, the United States appeared to stand firmly at the peak of its global power, the world's sole superpower, leading the war on terror and shaping the flow of the global economy. But less than a decade after the September 11th attacks, a crisis born inside America's own financial system would shake not only its economy, but the entire world. And from those cracks, a new international landscape would slowly take shape. In September 2008, Lehman Brothers, and one of the largest investment banks in the United States, with more than 150 years of history, declared bankruptcy. It was the breaking point of a chain reaction that had begun with the housing bubble and high-risk credit markets in the early 2000s. Lehman's collapse set off a global shockwave. Stock markets plunged, major banks wavered, and millions of Americans lost their homes, jobs, and retirement savings. The Great Recession had begun, the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Unemployment in the US climbed to nearly 10% in 2009, GDP shrank, and public confidence in the financial system was shaken to its core. The US government was forced to intervene on a historic scale. The Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, a $700 billion bailout, was launched to stabilize the banking system. The Federal Reserve slashed interest rates to near zero and began aggressive quantitative easing to flood the economy with liquidity. This marked a major turning point in the relationship between the state and the market. A new voice in the White House. In the middle of this turmoil, Americans longed for change. In 2008, Barack Obama, a young senator from Illinois, was elected president, the first African American in U.S. history to hold the office. His campaign slogan, "Yes, we can," echoed across the country as a promise of hope and renewal. The Obama administration swiftly enacted the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, an $800 billion stimulus package aimed at reviving the economy. Key industries, like the auto sector, received direct support. The job market slowly recovered, though unevenly. Rethinking U.S. power abroad. After nearly a decade of war in Afghanistan and Iraq, the United States faced mounting financial and political costs. The Obama administration pursued what it called smart power, a strategy combining selective military strength with diplomacy. One of the most significant shifts came in 2011 with the announcement of the pivot to Asia, focusing attention on the Asia-Pacific region, where China was rising rapidly. At the same time, the U.S. sought to reduce its direct military footprint in the Middle East. In 2011, Obama formally ended the combat mission in Iraq. Although direct involvement decreased, the war on terror continued in a different form. Covert operations and unmanned aerial vehicle strikes intensified. The symbolic peak of this new strategy came on May 2, 2011, when a team of U.S. Navy SEALs killed Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan, ending nearly a decade of pursuit of the al-Qaeda leader. It was a powerful moment of national catharsis, but not the end of global terrorism. Soon after al-Qaeda weakened, a new threat, Islamic State, emerged, destabilizing entire regions and reshaping security challenges, a changing global landscape. The world had changed dramatically since the early post-Cold War years. China had grown at breakneck speed, becoming the world's second-largest economy. Russia, under Vladimir Putin, was regaining geopolitical influence. Regional power blocs like the European Union, BRICS, and Association of Southeast Asian Nations were asserting a larger role. The world was no longer orbiting around a single center of power. The unipolar order was gradually giving way to a more multipolar world, one that was more fragmented, more complex, and more competitive. The digital revolution. Meanwhile, technology was transforming life inside the United States. Facebook, launched in 2004, YouTube, 2005, Twitter, 2006, and the iPhone, 2007, ushered in a new era of global connectivity. Information traveled at the speed of light, breaking traditional barriers in media and communication. But this digital revolution also brought deep social shifts. Political polarization intensified, misinformation spread rapidly, and new networks of influence grew in the online world. These changes would leave a lasting mark on American elections and policymaking in the years to come. As a nation at a crossroads. After more than a decade of war, financial turmoil, and accelerated globalization, the United States entered a period of contradictions. Economic growth returned, but inequality widened. Working-class communities felt left behind, while tech giants and financial corporations soared. Debates over immigration, racial justice, economic inequality, and civil rights became sharper and more divisive. These fractures were not entirely new, but they were deepening. and they would shape the course of American politics in the decade ahead. In November 2016, the United States experienced one of the most surprising and globally impactful presidential elections in its modern history. While most analysts and polls predicted a victory for Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton, the final results stunned the world. A businessman and reality TV star, Donald Trump, became the 45th President of the United States. This was more than a political upset. It reflected deep undercurrents running through American society, frustration, division, and a sense that the old order was no longer working. The roots of a political earthquake. Trump's victory cannot be separated from the broader social and economic shifts of the previous decades. Rapid globalization had benefited urban middle classes and large corporations, but many traditional working-class communities, particularly in the industrial Midwest, had lost jobs. Factories had moved overseas, inequality had widened, and millions felt left behind. Trump tapped into these emotions with a simple but powerful slogan, "Make America Great Again." He promised to bring jobs back to America, tighten borders, pull back from international agreements that many believed disadvantaged the U.S., and speak bluntly rather than rely on traditional diplomatic language. It was a political style unlike anything seen in modern American presidential history. A sharp turn in foreign and domestic policy. From the start of his presidency, the Trump administration reversed many long-standing U.S. policies. In 2017, the United States withdrew from the Paris Agreement on climate change, a move that shocked much of the international community. It also pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a major trade agreement designed to strengthen U.S. influence in the Asia-Pacific region. Trump launched a full-scale trade war against China, starting in 2018 by imposing tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. Washington aimed to pressure Beijing into changing its trade and intellectual property practices. China responded in kind, creating the largest economic and geopolitical confrontation between the two countries since they established diplomatic relations in 1979. Meanwhile, relations with traditional allies, including the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, the European Union, and key Asian partners, grew tense as Trump questioned long-standing security and trade commitments. Immigration, identity, and division. One of the most polarizing issues of this era was immigration. The Trump administration enacted strict measures, including Executive Order 13,769, commonly known as the Muslim ban, which barred entry to citizens from several Muslim-majority countries. Additional efforts focused on tightening the southern border, building a wall along the border with Mexico, and ramping up arrests of undocumented immigrants. These policies sparked nationwide protests, lawsuits, and fierce debate. Many saw them as measures to protect national borders, others viewed them as xenophobic and a threat to core American values. The digital battlefield of 2016. Unlike past elections which were shaped by television and traditional media, the 2016 race was defined by digital platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Fake news, online influence campaigns, and viral information flows played an outsized role in shaping public opinion. Political polarization, already present, deepened rapidly in this environment. The two major political camps no longer just disagreed. They lived in different information universes, making shared dialogue increasingly difficult. A changing world order. As America turned inward, the global landscape was shifting. China expanded its reach through the Belt and Road Initiative. Russia increased military activity and intervened in conflicts such as Ukraine and Syria. Meanwhile, trust and cohesion within the Western alliance weakened. Many scholars saw this as a transitional moment from a unipolar world dominated by the US to a more fragmented, multipolar global order. A global pandemic. In late 2019, a new global crisis emerged, the COVID-19 pandemic. By early 2020, the virus had spread worldwide, reaching the United States with devastating speed. Major cities such as New York City, Los Angeles, and Chicago became epicenters of the outbreak. The federal government's inconsistent response, along with fierce debates over masks, vaccines, and lockdown measures, exposed deep divisions in American society. The pandemic was not only a public health emergency, but also a political and social stress test. A nation more divided. As Trump's presidency entered its final year, America was more polarized than it had been in decades. Massive demonstrations erupted, from the George Floyd protests against racial injustice in 2020 to protests over pandemic restrictions. These movements revealed fractures running through communities, classes, and regions. What was unfolding was no longer just a political divide, it was a deeper social rupture, one tied to identity, power, and competing visions for the nation's future. In the year 2020, the United States found itself standing at a historic crossroads. The COVID-19 pandemic spread rapidly, turning one of the wealthiest and most powerful nations on Earth into one of the hardest-hit epicenters of the crisis. Infections and deaths rose by the day, hospitals were overwhelmed, global supply chains fractured, millions of Americans lost their jobs in a matter of weeks, financial markets plunged, major cities fell silent under lockdowns, filled with an unfamiliar and growing sense of fear. The pandemic was not just a public health emergency, it was a test, a profound reckoning for the nation's trust, its institutions, and its capacity to respond. Cracks in the political, economic, and social fabric that had long existed were now impossible to ignore. A historic election in the shadow of a crisis. In November 2020, the country held a presidential election unlike any before it. Tens of millions of Americans voted by mail to avoid the risk of infection. Disputes over ballot counting, accusations of fraud, and intense political division made the election one of the most contentious moments since the American Civil War. Democratic candidate Joe Biden won the election, becoming the 46th President of the United States. But the result did not bring immediate unity. A large portion of Donald Trump's supporters rejected the outcome, culminating in the January 6th United States Capitol attack, when protesters stormed the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Images of the U.S. Capitol, a symbol of modern democracy, under siege, stunned the world. This was not just a political event. It revealed the depth of polarization within American society, where two halves of the country seem to speak different languages, believe in different information sources, and imagine opposite futures. Governing in a time of division. The Biden administration inherited a nation in profound crisis. A massive vaccination campaign began in early 2021, making the U.S. one of the fastest countries in the world to roll out vaccines. But political polarization made containing the pandemic difficult. States led by opposing parties clashed over public health measures, mask mandates, lockdowns, and vaccine requirements. Beyond public health, the pandemic forced America to restructure its economy and society in fundamental ways. Economy. Trillions of dollars in stimulus were deployed, including the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, to support businesses, workers, and economic recovery. Labor. Millions shifted to remote work, transforming how people worked, learned, and lived in cities. Supply chains. Shortages of semiconductors, medical supplies, and critical goods spurred a renewed push for industrial resilience and reduced dependence on foreign suppliers. A return to global leadership in a changed world. On the international stage, the new administration quickly rejoined the Paris Agreement, reaffirmed US leadership in international institutions, and sought to rebuild traditional alliances with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and the European Union. But the world was no longer what it had been in the 1990s. China had emerged as a formidable strategic rival. US-China relations entered an era of full-spectrum competition in trade, technology, supply chains, cyberspace, and geopolitical influence. Terms like strategic competition and great power rivalry became central to Washington's national strategy. In 2022, the Russian invasion of Ukraine pulled the United States back to the forefront of NATO leadership. Washington played a key role in supporting Ukraine, helping to restore part of its international standing after years of uncertainty. This marked another turning point, reaffirming America's role as a global security pillar. Though no longer the uncontested superpower it was in the post-Cold War era. Economic strain and a shifting domestic landscape. In the wake of the pandemic, the US faced a wave of new challenges. Inflation soared to its highest level in more than 40 years in 2022, prompting the Federal Reserve to repeatedly raise interest rates in an effort to slow price increases. This created a dual pressure, slower economic growth and rising living costs, hitting working and middle-class Americans especially hard. At the same time, the clean energy transition accelerated with initiatives like the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, aimed at positioning the United States as a global hub for green technology and renewable energy. This was not just environmental policy, it was an industrial and geopolitical strategy. Polarization, technology, and trust. Political and social polarization continued to deepen. Debates over vaccines, reproductive rights, immigration, climate policy, and gun control became the front lines of political conflict. Platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok played central roles in shaping public opinion. But they also amplified divisions, creating echo chambers that pushed groups further apart. A crisis of trust in government, the media, and even science emerged as one of the nation's most pressing challenges. The United States, once bound by shared stories, now felt like a nation living in parallel realities. A superpower in a multipolar world. As the early 2020s unfolded, it became clear that America remained a superpower, but one operating in a multipolar world. Power was no longer concentrated in a single nation. US-China competition, tensions with Russia, and the rise of regional power centers made the global landscape more complex and unpredictable than ever. And yet, the United States still held significant advantages: a vast and dynamic economy, unmatched technological power, a global network of allies, and a proven capacity to reinvent itself after every crisis. If there is one constant that runs through the entire history of the United States, it is movement. America has never stood still, not during its colonial days, not in the era of westward expansion, not in the industrial revolutions, not between world wars, and not in the age of globalization or during a pandemic. The history of this nation is a continuous current, sometimes roaring and violent, sometimes slow and subtle, but never motionless. From the indigenous peoples who built Cahokia and ancient North American cultures to 1492, when Christopher Columbus landed on the continent, the United States did not yet exist as a nation. Yet within just a few short centuries, it rose to become one of the forces capable of shaping the destiny of the world. It is a journey marked by brilliance and darkness, as with every great civilization in history. Since declaring independence in 1776, America has moved through defining crossroads: westward expansion, the American Civil War, industrialization, 2 world wars, the Cold War, and the era of globalization after 1991. In each of these periods, the United States did not just reshape itself, it helped reshape the world. After the World War II, the US entered an era where its power stretched across the globe, not only through weapons or military might, but through ideas, culture, technology, and economic influence. From Berlin to Tokyo, from Seoul to Baghdad, decisions made in Washington, D.C. could send shockwaves around the world. But alongside that glow came scars, wars, divisions, economic crises, social inequalities, strategic missteps, and crises of trust. Over more than 2 centuries, the world has transformed profoundly. From the age of empires, humanity has moved into the era of globalization, and now into the multipolar age of the 21st century. China has risen as a major power, Russia has returned as a military force, and the European Union, along with other regional power centers, have gained a stronger voice. In such a world, the United States is no longer the only actor on stage as it was after 1991. Yet America's legacy still runs deep in the veins of this era. The liberal democratic model, the global financial system, digital technology, popular culture, the dominant global language, and the widest network of alliances in the world. These are not things that easily fade, even as global power becomes more dispersed. The future of the United States will be shaped not only by what happens beyond its borders, but also by what happens within. Domestically, the nation faces pressing challenges with no simple solutions. Deep political polarization, widening economic inequality, a crisis of trust, cultural and racial tensions, and the accelerating transformation of technology. On the global stage, America will have to compete, sometimes fiercely, with rising powers while maintaining leadership on issues like climate change, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, space, international finance, and shared legal frameworks. The history of the United States has never been a smooth story. It is a sequence of experiments and corrections, of prosperous eras intertwined with crises, of great leaps forward accompanied by painful mistakes. But one trait has allowed this nation to endure and rise through every turning point: its capacity for reinvention. From George Washington to Joe Biden, from the dirt roads of the 18th century to the superhighways and technology hubs of the 21st, this country has constantly redefined itself, not always through agreement, but through the pressures of reality, of debate, of trial. Perhaps that is the true essence of America. Not a finished paradise, but a work in progress, a nation that never stops building itself. In the middle of the 21st century, the United States once again stands at a historic crossroads, a moment when global power has shifted, domestic trust is being tested, and the future remains uncertain. But if we look back over more than 500 years, from the first footprints on the shores of the Atlantic, one pattern becomes clear. Whenever America faces a crisis, it transforms itself, sometimes painfully, but always with resilience. History, after all, is not a fixed map. It is a river. And through the centuries, America has learned how to move with that river. Sometimes swimming upstream, sometimes going with the current, but never sinking. Perhaps that is what makes the story of the United States, from the ancient plains to the glowing cities of today, one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of humankind.